The night Charlotte Astor stepped into society exactly as she was expected to, and quietly decided she would not obey it, was the moment Gilded Age perfection began to crack. Gaslight shimmered across silk and diamonds, orchestras softened the air, and New York's elite gathered to reassure themselves that their world was fixed, orderly, and untouchable. Names still ruled, appearances still mattered, and the Astor name, above all others, was meant to stand as proof that refinement could never fail. But glamour, when worn too flawlessly, becomes dangerous. Charlotte Astor was raised to move through this world without friction, to marry correctly, to behave discreetly, to embody wealth without ever questioning it. Instead, she learned its weaknesses. Beneath the etiquette and rigid smiles lay a system terrified of deviation, obsessed with control, and utterly unprepared for a woman who understood the rules well enough to bend them without apology. What followed was not scandal in the crude sense, but something far more unsettling. Charlotte did not flee society. She challenged it from within. Every choice she made exposed how fragile high society truly was, how quickly admiration could curdle into outrage, and how unforgiving the Gilded Age became when one of its own refused to play her part. If you're drawn to stories where elegance hides defiance, where wealth cannot silence consequence, and where history's most polished rooms conceal their deepest fractures, stay with me. Like the video, subscribe, and settle in, because this is not just a tale of luxury, but of the quiet rebellion that shook America's most powerful families from the inside. Charlotte Astor entered the world not as a child first, but as a presence already accounted for. Before she learned the sound of her own name, it had been spoken by others, measured, assessed, weighed against expectation. In the softly lit rooms of her family's homes, nothing occurred. Without observation. Servants moved with practiced quiet, relatives spoke in tones polished smooth by inheritance. Even infancy, wrapped in linen and lace, was treated as a condition to be managed correctly. From the beginning, attention was not affection. It was inspection. Her earliest years unfolded in interiors designed to reassure. High ceilings, pale walls, furniture arranged to suggest ease while enforcing order. Gaslight softened every edge, giving faces a charitable glow that concealed their scrutiny. Charlotte was admired for her calm, praised for her stillness, remarked upon for how little trouble she caused. These were not casual compliments. They were early confirmations that she understood, instinctively it was said, how to exist properly. Children of lesser households were permitted clumsiness, noise, appetite. Charlotte was permitted none of these for long. Each impulse was gently redirected, each excess quietly corrected. A hand placed on her back when she moved, too quickly. A look held a second longer than necessary when her voice rose. Correction rarely arrived as reprimand. It arrived as guidance, spoken softly, delivered with smiles that never quite reached the eyes. In the Gilded Age, wealth promised protection, but it also demanded performance. Charlotte learned this without ever being taught explicitly. Her days were structured not around curiosity but around preparation, how to sit, how to listen, how to accept praise without appearing to seek it. Adults spoke of her future as if it were a destination already reached. She would be admired, she would marry well, she would represent the family without incident. These certainties were repeated so often, they hardened into fact. What no one noticed, or perhaps what they chose not to notice, was how little space remained for discovery. Charlotte was not encouraged to ask who she might become. She was instructed on how to maintain what already was. Visitors came and went, pausing to remark on her manners, her composure, the seriousness in her gaze. She learned quickly that stillness invited approval. Silence drew admiration. The less she revealed, the more she was praised. In this way, restraint became a form of currency, and Charlotte paid willingly, because there was no visible alternative. The household itself reinforced the lesson. Servants were present but invisible, their labor absorbed into the environment like furniture or light. Their discretion modeled a particular kind of success, to exist without drawing attention, to perform flawlessly without recognition. Charlotte absorbed this hierarchy intuitively. Everyone was watched. Some were simply watched more politely than others. As she grew, her world expanded in scale, but not in freedom. Larger rooms, more elaborate gatherings, more eyes. Family dinners carried an air of rehearsal, conversations circling safely around approved topics. Laughter was permitted, but only at the correct volume. Emotion was acceptable, so long as it remained legible and brief. Excess of feeling, of opinion, of desire was treated as a kind of social illness. Charlotte's education reflected the same priorities. She was taught languages to converse, music to entertain, history to contextualize her place within a lineage that predated her and would outlast her. Knowledge was ornamental, not exploratory. Every skill was meant to refine her surface, not deepen her interior. By the time she reached adolescence, Charlotte had become what society expected with alarming ease. She moved gracefully through rooms. She spoke with care. She appeared to all observers entirely formed. Yet beneath the polish lay a quiet fatigue, a sense that her life was being lived in advance by others, that each milestone had been arranged before she arrived to meet it. Being born into privilege had spared her hardship, but it had also denied her invisibility. There was no moment when she was not being evaluated, no phase where mistakes could pass unnoticed. Even innocence was curated. Charlotte Astor did not yet know she would one day shock high society, but she already understood something essential: that perfection, once achieved, leaves no room to breathe. The Astor name did not announce itself loudly. It did not need to. It moved through rooms ahead of Charlotte, arriving before she did, settling expectations into place like furniture long familiar. Doors opened without hesitation. Conversations softened, adjusted, corrected themselves mid-sentence. People smiled not because they felt warmth, but because they recognized gravity. From an early age, Charlotte understood that her surname carried more authority than her voice ever could. It was spoken with a particular restraint, never too casually, never with awe, but always with recognition. To bear it was to inherit not only wealth, but a reputation maintained through generations of careful behavior. The Astors were not known for spectacle. They were known for control. Control, she learned, was the highest form of power in high society. Family history was treated less as story and more as instruction. Names of ancestors surfaced during dinners, not as anecdotes, but as reminders. Men and women who had navigated public life without embarrassment, who had understood when to appear and when to retreat, when to give generously and when to withhold. Their successes were spoken of as inevitabilities, their failures edited into abstractions or omitted entirely. Charlotte absorbed these lessons quietly, understanding that legacy was not something to be celebrated, but something to be preserved. With the name came protection, but it was a conditional protection. The Astor name could deflect criticism, soften rumor, delay consequence, but it could not erase transgression. It functioned like a carefully maintained shield, polished daily, inspected constantly for cracks. Charlotte felt this maintenance in the way her actions were monitored, in the subtle recalibrations that followed even minor deviations from expectation. A laugh held a second too long, a question asked too directly, a preference expressed without proper framing. Each moment was noted, if not aloud, then in the silence that followed. Correction rarely came in the form of punishment. It arrived as reminder, a phrase repeated gently, a look exchanged across the table. The Astor name did not scold, it guided, and guidance was far more difficult to refuse. Outside the family, the name functioned as currency. Invitations were extended with ease. Apologies were accepted quickly. Missteps were forgiven, provided they remained small and infrequent. Charlotte watched others navigate society without such insulation and learned the unspoken difference between privilege and immunity. The Astor name could cushion a fall, but only if one fell correctly. As Charlotte grew older, she became increasingly aware that the name shaped not only how others treated her, but how they interpreted her. Compliments were filtered through expectation. Praise was never neutral. Her intelligence was remarked upon as refinement, her kindness as breeding, her restraint as evidence of proper upbringing. Nothing was allowed to exist on its own merit. Everything was proof of something larger. This constant interpretation produced a quiet pressure. Charlotte did not feel owned by her family, but she felt represented by them at all times. Her actions reflected backward and outward, touching people she would never meet, ancestors long dead, alliances long forged. Individuality, when acknowledged at all, was tolerated only as ornament. There were moments, rare, fleeting, when Charlotte sensed the weight shift, when she imagined what it might feel like to move through a room without preface, to speak without calculation, to be judged only for what she did in that moment rather than what her name implied. These thoughts were not rebellious. They were not yet even desires. They were questions, quiet and quickly suppressed. Because the Astor name did not simply grant access, it demanded compliance. Charlotte learned to carry it as one carries a fragile object, carefully, constantly aware of its presence, fearful not of dropping it, but of being seen mishandling it. And so she moved forward, admired, protected, and constrained, already sensing that what shielded her so completely also left very little room for escape. The name had made her visible everywhere. It had also made disappearance impossible. The rooms were never empty, even when no one was present. Long after voices faded and silk ceased its whispering, they retained an awareness, an expectation that someone would soon return to be assessed. Charlotte learned this early. Space itself participated in scrutiny. Drawing rooms were arranged to appear inviting while offering no refuge. Chairs angled toward one another, encouraging conversation but discouraging retreat. Mirrors placed strategically, not for vanity alone, but for confirmation, how one appeared from every possible angle. Nothing accidental, nothing forgiving. Light entered softly through tall windows, filtered by lace and drapery chosen to flatter faces without revealing too much. Gaslight took over in the evenings, blurring edges, forgiving flaws, and creating the illusion of warmth where discipline prevailed. Charlotte moved through these rooms with care, sensing their purpose long before she could articulate it. They were stages disguised as domestic comfort. One entered not to relax, but to perform calmness convincingly. Even as a child, she noticed how posture changed upon crossing certain thresholds, how voices softened, how laughter recalibrated itself, trimmed of excess. The rooms demanded this adjustment without ever asking for it. Visitors were seated deliberately, elders positioned where they could observe without appearing to do so. Younger guests arranged to be seen, but not heard too forcefully. Charlotte watched these silent choreographies unfold with increasing awareness. She learned where to stand, where not to linger, how to occupy space without asserting ownership of it. The lesson was subtle but persistent. Presence was tolerated only when measured. These interiors were not neutral backdrops. They were instruments. The arrangement of furniture suggested where attention should settle. A slight elevation here, a narrower passage there, paths that guided movement without announcing control. Charlotte learned that freedom of motion was an illusion granted only to those who already understood its limits. Conversation within these rooms followed its own architecture. Topics were selected carefully, circulating around safe subjects: charity, travel, mild political concern, never lingering too long, never digging too deeply. Personal feeling was allowed only as anecdote, framed with distance and restraint. Emotion could be referenced, but never explored. Charlotte learned to listen for what was omitted, for the pauses that spoke louder than the words themselves. As she grew older, she began to recognize the room's deeper function. They were corrective spaces. One entered them already anticipating judgment. Behavior adjusted automatically, instinctively. The rooms enforced standards without the need for confrontation. They rewarded conformity with comfort and punished deviation with subtle discomfort. An awkward silence, a missed invitation, a seat slightly less favorable than before. Charlotte felt this pressure keenly. Even solitude within these spaces felt conditional. When alone, she sensed how easily observation could return. The rooms never truly belonged to her. They belonged to expectation, to reputation, to the invisible audience always presumed present. It was here that Charlotte learned the peculiar anxiety of being admired. Compliments arrived as evaluations, so poised, so composed, such presence. Each phrase reinforced the idea that her value resided not in her interior life, but in how seamlessly she occupied these rooms, how little disturbance she caused, how reliably she fulfilled the role assigned to her. She became adept at reading the room itself, its mood, its temperature, its tolerance. She knew when to speak and when silence would be more effective. She knew how to exit conversations gracefully, how to avoid corners where scrutiny intensified. These skills were praised as maturity, as grace, as refinement. Yet beneath this competence lay a quiet unease. Charlotte began to sense that the rooms were not preparing her for life, but for display, that they were training her not to understand herself, but to manage perception. The walls seemed to close in not physically, but psychologically, narrowing the range of acceptable behavior until it fit neatly within the confines of good taste. The rooms built for judgment did their work efficiently. They shaped Charlotte without ever touching her. They instructed without speaking. And as she mastered their demands, she began to realize something unsettling. The more perfectly she belonged in these rooms, the less room there was for her to belong to herself. She did not yet know what she would do with this realization, but the rooms had already taught her what they expected. Glamour was never introduced to Charlotte as pleasure. It arrived instead as responsibility, presented with the same seriousness as duty and lineage. From the moment she was deemed old enough to be seen rather than merely present, her appearance became a matter of collective interest. Dresses were selected not to express taste but to signal alignment. Fabrics spoke a language she learned to read fluently. Silk for confidence, lace for restraint, muted tones for discretion, embellishment measured carefully to avoid accusation. Every fitting was an education. Hands adjusted hems while voices murmured approval or hesitation. A bodice too daring was quietly dismissed, a color too vibrant softened. Nothing was ever described as forbidden. It was simply not suitable, a phrase that carried the weight of finality without the discomfort of refusal. Charlotte absorbed these judgments without resistance, understanding that suitability mattered more than desire. Glamour, she learned, was a form of reassurance. It told the world that everything was as it should be, that wealth remained tasteful, that femininity remained controlled, that power had not grown reckless. When Charlotte entered a room properly dressed, she was not merely admired, she was confirming stability. The Astor name remained safe in her care. This expectation followed her relentlessly. Hair was arranged to suggest effortlessness achieved through labor. Jewelry was chosen to imply abundance without ostentation. Even posture participated in the performance, straight enough to convey discipline, relaxed enough to suggest ease. Charlotte's body became a surface upon which reassurance was projected, every detail contributing to a narrative of composure. There were moments when she sensed the artificiality of it all, when the weight of fabric felt excessive, when the mirror reflected not herself, but a role being perfected. Yet these thoughts were fleeting, dismissed almost as quickly as they arose. To question glamour was to question the structure that sustained her world, and that structure rewarded compliance generously. Compliments flowed predictably. Radiant, flawless, so very Astor. Each word affirmed not who she was, but how successfully she fulfilled expectation. Charlotte learned to receive praise without reacting to it, accepting admiration as one accepted weather, present, unavoidable, and ultimately impersonal. The obligation extended beyond clothing. Expression itself was curated. A smile held just long enough, eyes attentive but not inquisitive, emotion calibrated carefully, never spilling into excess. Glamour demanded control, and control demanded vigilance. Charlotte became skilled at managing her own visibility, knowing when to draw attention and when to soften into the background. Other women watched her closely, some with envy, some with calculation, some with quiet relief that she carried the burden so well. Charlotte understood that glamour functioned as a standard against which others were measured, and that her performance affected not only herself, but the hierarchy of the room. To falter would not simply invite criticism, it would unsettle the balance. What troubled her most was not the effort required, but the assumption beneath it, that glamour was owed, that her appearance was not her own, but a contribution to collective confidence. That failure to present correctly would be interpreted not as individuality, but as negligence. In private moments, rare and brief, Charlotte allowed the facade to loosen, shoes removed, hairpins set aside. The mirror still present reflected someone quieter, less deliberate. These moments carried a strange intimacy, tinged with guilt, as though she were neglecting a duty even in solitude. She began to recognize glamour as a discipline rather than an indulgence. It was maintained through repetition, vigilance, and fear of deviation, and while it granted her admiration and authority within her world, it also bound her tightly to its expectations. Charlotte Astor was not glamorous because she wished to be. She was glamorous because she was required to be, and because she had learned too well what it cost to refuse. Correctness was introduced to Charlotte before she understood error. It was not framed as a rule to be learned, but as an atmosphere to be absorbed, like the faint medicinal sweetness that lingered in well-appointed rooms, a scent that suggested cleanliness, order, and quiet authority. By the time she could articulate preferences, she had already been taught which ones were acceptable. Her childhood unfolded with remarkable smoothness. Days followed predictable rhythms, governed by schedules that appeared gentle but allowed no improvisation. Lessons began and ended on time. Meals were taken at hours, agreed upon long before she had any say in them. Even leisure was structured carefully, its boundaries disguised as generosity. Charlotte was permitted enjoyment so long as it remained measured, improving, and unobtrusive. Mistakes were treated as inconveniences rather than disasters, but they were remembered. A dropped utensil, a mispronounced word, a moment of impatience, each was corrected immediately, quietly, and without visible irritation. Correction arrived not with raised voices, but with recalibration. An adult stepping in, a phrase repeated more slowly, a demonstration offered as though for Charlotte's benefit rather than her discipline. She learned quickly that visible disapproval was unnecessary. Expectation alone was sufficient. The adults around her spoke often of her good sense, a phrase that suggested both maturity and restraint. She was praised for understanding when to be silent, for waiting her turn without protest, for absorbing instruction without resistance. These virtues were celebrated as signs of character rather than compliance, and Charlotte accepted them as such. Approval felt warm. It felt safe. Play, when permitted, was supervised gently but continuously. Toys were chosen for their refinement. Games encouraged patience rather than competition. Curiosity was indulged only insofar as it could be guided toward acceptable knowledge. Questions that wandered too far were redirected, not discouraged outright, but softened into something safer, more abstract. Charlotte learned the subtle art of asking without probing, of wondering without insisting. She watched other children, cousins, guests, acquaintances, navigate these same expectations with varying degrees of success. Those who resisted were labeled difficult. Those who faltered were pitied. Those who adapted were praised. Charlotte observed these outcomes closely, internalizing the lesson without conscious effort. Correctness was not merely encouraged, it was rewarded consistently. Emotion, too, was subject to instruction. Joy was acceptable if contained. Sadness was acknowledged but expected to pass quietly. Anger was smoothed over before it could fully surface, reframed as fatigue or misunderstanding. Charlotte learned to recognize which feelings could be displayed and which were best managed privately, if at all. Emotional discipline was presented as kindness to oneself, to others, to the harmony of the household. Her education reinforced the same principles. Tutors spoke approvingly of her attentiveness, her neat handwriting, her ability to replicate information precisely. Creativity was encouraged only within defined limits. Originality was admired when it echoed established taste. Divergence, when it appeared, was gently redirected until it resembled tradition. Charlotte did not experience this upbringing as oppressive. It was all she knew. The boundaries were invisible precisely because they had always been there. Freedom, in this context, was defined not by choice, but by competence, the ability to move gracefully within constraint. She became adept at this, earning praise that further confirmed the value of her restraint. Yet, even in childhood, a faint unease accompanied this correctness, a sense that something essential was being deferred indefinitely. That life was preparation without arrival. Charlotte could not yet name this feeling, but she recognized its presence in the quiet moments between lessons, in the pauses after compliments, in the lingering sense that approval came with conditions she did not fully understand. Correctness shaped her without resistance, molding her habits, her instincts, her sense of self. It taught her how to be admired, how to belong, how to move through the world without friction. But it also taught her something else, something far more subtle, that being good was not the same as being known, and that realization, though still faint, had already begun to take hold. Wealth did not grant Charlotte Astor solitude. It dissolved it. From the outside, her life appeared cushioned, insulated from intrusion by gates, servants, and distance. In truth, these layers functioned less as barriers and more as conduits. Information traveled efficiently through them, moving quietly from room to room, house to house, drawing conclusions long before Charlotte herself was aware she had been observed. Privacy, she learned, was a privilege reserved for those whose lives were deemed unimportant. Within her own household, nothing was ever entirely hers. Rooms were entered for cleaning, adjustment, maintenance, always with permission, always politely, but always thoroughly. Drawers were organized, personal effects repositioned, letters delivered and removed. Even absence was noticed. A closed door did not suggest retreat, it prompted concern. A prolonged quiet invited inquiry. Charlotte adapted instinctively. She learned to keep her thoughts orderly, her belongings minimal, her habits predictable. Disorder attracted attention, uncertainty invited intervention. The smooth functioning of her life depended upon transparency, and transparency was rewarded with trust that never quite translated into freedom. Outside the household, surveillance took on a different character. Society watched not directly but collectively. Appearances were logged mentally. Conversations recalled selectively. Behaviors interpreted and reinterpreted until they settled into narrative. Charlotte discovered that nothing she did existed in isolation. A gesture at one gathering resurfaced as rumor at another. A preference expressed casually hardened into reputation. This attention was not malicious. It was procedural. High society treated observation as maintenance, a way of preserving its own coherence. The wealthy were expected to be visible, legible, and reliable. Privacy suggested secrecy. Secrecy suggested risk. Charlotte learned to present herself accordingly. She became careful not only in action, but in omission. What she did not say mattered as much as what she did. What she avoided could be as telling as what she pursued. Silence, she discovered, was rarely empty. It was filled by interpretation. Even her moments of rest were subject to evaluation. Retreat from social obligations prompted questions framed as concern. Fatigue was acknowledged briefly, then expected to resolve. Prolonged withdrawal unsettled people. It implied dissatisfaction, or worse, reflection. Charlotte understood that reflection, when visible, was unwelcome. She began to sense that wealth functioned as a magnifying lens. Every minor detail appeared enlarged, significant, worthy of commentary. She envied quietly those who could vanish into anonymity, who could act without consequence, simply because no one was watching closely enough to care. Yet, anonymity was not an option available to her. The Astor name ensured that attention followed her effortlessly. She carried visibility with her, inseparable from her presence. To exist was to be noticed. To be noticed was to be assessed. Charlotte responded by becoming exquisitely consistent. Predictability offered safety. When people believed they knew what to expect, they relaxed their scrutiny slightly. She learned how to create this illusion, how to allow others to feel comfortable in their assumptions about her. It was not honesty, but it was survival. Still, the cost accumulated quietly. Without privacy, thought itself felt exposed. Charlotte found herself rehearsing opinions internally, testing them for acceptability before allowing them to surface even in solitude. The gaze of society lingered in her mind, an internalized observer that never fully departed. She wondered occasionally what it would mean to be unobserved, to act without leaving an impression, to experience something without its immediate conversion into story. These thoughts remained abstract, distant, but persistent. Wealth had granted Charlotte security, admiration, and access, but it had also stripped her of something more subtle and more essential, the freedom to be unseen. And as she moved deeper into a life lived under constant watch, she began to understand that the absence of privacy did not merely limit behavior, It reshaped identity, and she was only just beginning to feel the strain. Time 2.5s. Stillness was not taught to Charlotte Astor as an absence of movement. It was taught as a skill, one refined through repetition, rewarded through approval, and perfected through vigilance. To be still did not mean to be idle. It meant to be controlled. From an early age, she learned that motion attracted attention, and attention invited correction. A restless hand, a shifting posture, an impulsive step forward. Each was gently intercepted, adjusted, smoothed away. The lesson was never delivered as restriction. It was framed as polish. Grace, she was told, resided in restraint. Charlotte practiced this discipline daily, sitting through long visits without interruption, standing through conversations not meant for her participation, listening without reaction, observing without response. Her body learned obedience before her mind fully understood its purpose. Muscles held tension invisibly. Breath slowed, expression settled into neutrality that could be softened or sharpened on command. Adults praised her composure. So calm, they said. So self-possessed. These compliments arrived early and often, reinforcing the value of immobility. Charlotte noticed how admiration clustered around those who took up the least space, who gestured minimally, spoke carefully, and never seemed in a hurry to assert themselves. Stillness, she learned, was interpreted as confidence. It was also interpreted as virtue. In social gatherings, she observed how the room favored those who waited, those who did not rush to fill silence, those who allowed others to speak first. Silence became a tool, not an absence. Charlotte learned to wield it with precision. A pause could invite attention. A quiet presence could command more respect than interruption ever would. Yet stillness demanded constant effort. It required anticipation of conversation, of reaction, of judgment. Charlotte trained herself to remain unreadable until certainty arrived. Emotion was allowed to surface only when it could be shaped safely, displayed briefly, then withdrawn without residue. She became adept at this emotional choreography, praised for her maturity, her control, her elegance. The cost of this discipline was subtle. Movement, when finally permitted, felt conspicuous. Spontaneity felt dangerous. Charlotte became aware of her body as something to be managed rather than inhabited. Even in moments of solitude, she found herself maintaining the posture of observation, as though someone might return at any moment. She watched others fail at this lesson and noted the consequences. A young woman who laughed too loudly became a topic of amusement. A guest who spoke too freely found invitations arriving less frequently. Excess was not punished directly. It was remembered. Stillness, by contrast, offered invisibility with invisibility, a way to be present without becoming vulnerable. Charlotte internalized this hierarchy deeply. She learned to slow her reactions, to soften her impulses, to hold herself back from urgency. Stillness became reflexive, a default state. It granted her safety, admiration, and trust, but it also imposed distance from others, from herself. There were moments when the discipline faltered, brief instances of impatience, flashes of irritation, a laugh that escaped unfiltered. These moments were quickly corrected, either by herself or by those around her. Stillness reasserted itself, smoothing over disruption, restoring balance. Yet each correction left a trace, a faint awareness that the effort was continuous, that relaxation itself had become conditional. Charlotte began to sense that stillness was not simply a behavior expected of her, but a mechanism that maintained order around her. Her composure reassured others that nothing unexpected would occur, that the world, at least within her orbit, remained predictable. In mastering stillness, Charlotte learned how to disappear without leaving the room. She became present, without disturbance, visible without demand. Society rewarded her for this skill generously. What it did not offer her was rest, because stillness, once perfected, does not end when the audience departs. It settles into the body, shaping instinct and reflex, teaching the self to pause before it dares to move. And Charlotte Astor, admired for her composure, began to understand that stillness was not peace. It was containment. Charlotte Astor's first formal appearances in society were spoken of as inevitabilities rather than events. They arrived not as milestones to be celebrated, but as procedures to be executed correctly. By the time invitations bore her name rather than her parents', the rooms already knew her. The expectations had been rehearsed for years. She entered these gatherings with a composure that appeared effortless, but had been carefully cultivated. Her movements were precise, neither timid nor assertive. Her voice carried just far enough. Her gaze met others without lingering. Those who observed her closely noted with approval how little instruction she seemed to require. Charlotte did not behave like someone new to attention. She behaved like someone returning to a role long prepared for her. The rooms received her as confirmation, heads inclined slightly. Conversations adjusted to include her without demanding anything of her. Compliments followed predictable lines, how well she had grown, how naturally she fit among adults, how perfectly she embodied what had always been expected. Charlotte accepted these remarks with practiced grace, understanding that gratitude itself was part of the performance. Introductions were delivered with care. Names carried weight, alliances hinted at through tone alone. Charlotte learned quickly how much could be conveyed without direct statement, a pause before a surname, a softened voice for one guest, a brisk formality for another. Society announced its internal hierarchy subtly, and Charlotte listened. She was watched closely, though never openly. Eyes followed her path through rooms as though charting something already anticipated. Every gesture was measured against a standard she could not see but felt keenly. This scrutiny did not feel hostile. It felt administrative, as though her presence required confirmation before being fully accepted. Charlotte discovered that being welcomed did not mean being known. Questions directed at her were polite and limited, designed to elicit safe responses. Education, travel, mild preferences. Anything more personal remained unasked, as though intimacy itself were inappropriate at this stage. She was not there to reveal herself, but to demonstrate readiness. She observed others with equal care, young women whose first appearances preceded hers, noting who was praised, who was quietly dismissed, who lingered too long at the margins. Society did not announce its judgments, it enacted them through repetition and omission. Invitations extended, or not. Conversations continued, or ended abruptly. Charlotte absorbed these patterns instinctively. Her own performance drew consistent approval. She did not overstay conversations. She did not dominate attention. She allowed admiration to find her without appearing to seek it. This balance, being visible without demanding notice, was regarded as rare and commendable. Charlotte was praised for it often, though never explicitly taught how to maintain it. As the evenings progressed, fatigue crept in quietly. The effort required to maintain composure accumulated gradually, unnoticed by others but keenly felt by Charlotte herself. She learned to manage this exhaustion discreetly, drawing on stillness, on silence, on the practiced calm that had been instilled in her since childhood. Leaving early was discouraged. Lingering too long was noted. She adjusted accordingly. By the end of each gathering, Charlotte returned home carrying the faint residue of performance, an awareness of being seen that did not dissipate immediately. She replayed moments internally, reviewing her responses, searching for any deviation that might have registered unfavorably. None were ever mentioned. Silence, she knew, did not mean absence of judgment. Her first social appearances established her reputation swiftly. She was spoken of approvingly, predictably, reassuringly. The Astor name had not faltered in her hands. Society relaxed, satisfied that she required no intervention, no correction, no guidance beyond what had already been provided. Yet, beneath this approval lay something unspoken. Charlotte sensed that these appearances had not introduced her to society so much as confirmed her availability to it. She had been accepted, yes, but accepted as something already defined. She had entered the public eye flawlessly. And in doing so, she had stepped fully into a life where every future choice would be measured against this initial perfection. Admiration reached Charlotte Astor long before familiarity ever did. It arrived fully formed, carrying conclusions that required no confirmation. By the time she had settled into the rhythm of public life, she was already spoken of as though her character were complete, her nature established, her future safely legible. People praised her with confidence, as if they were recalling facts rather than forming opinions. This admiration was not intimate. It did not stem from shared experience or genuine understanding. It was bestowed at a distance, curated through observation and repetition. Charlotte recognized this distinction instinctively. Compliments addressed her surface, her grace, her composure, her presence, never the substance beneath. She was admired as one admires architecture for symmetry, proportion, and reliability. Society spoke of her often, though rarely to her. Her name surfaced in conversations she did not hear, attached to approving nods and quiet satisfaction. She carries herself well. So well brought up. Exactly as one would expect. These assessments circulated freely, reinforcing one another until they solidified into reputation. Charlotte became aware that her image now preceded her, shaping interactions before she had the chance to influence them. Being admired before being known produced a peculiar tension. Charlotte sensed that curiosity about her was unnecessary, even unwelcome. People felt no need to inquire deeply when they believed they already understood her. Questions remained superficial, exchanges brief and courteous. Intimacy, when attempted, was gently redirected toward safer topics. The admiration acted as a barrier, preventing closeness while maintaining approval. She learned that deviation threatened this arrangement. Admiration was conditional, though its conditions were never articulated. It depended upon consistency, upon remaining aligned with the version of herself society had constructed. Charlotte felt this pressure acutely. To change, to surprise, risked disrupting not only her own standing, but the comfort others derived from her predictability. The admiration also isolated her from criticism in subtle ways. Praise arrived so readily that dissent felt inappropriate. Those who might have questioned her motives or intentions found little space to do so. The narrative surrounding her was already settled, leaving no room for complexity. Charlotte was admired not for what she revealed, but for what she concealed effectively. She noticed how this admiration altered behavior around her. People deferred without reason. They hesitated before disagreeing. They assumed agreement where none had been offered. Charlotte became aware that her presence influenced others unconsciously, shaping conversations and outcomes simply by existing within them. This influence unsettled her more than it pleased her. At times, she wondered what might happen if she failed to meet these expectations, if she revealed uncertainty or dissatisfaction or desire that did not align neatly with approval. The admiration felt fragile, like glass polished too thin. Beautiful, but easily cracked. She sensed that once broken, it would not be repaired with the same generosity. This realization deepened her restraint. Charlotte became increasingly careful not to introduce ambiguity where clarity was expected. She maintained the image presented to her, wearing it with practiced ease. The effort required was minimal by now. The habits were ingrained. Still, a quiet dissonance persisted, the sense that she was being praised for a version of herself that existed primarily in the minds of others. There were moments when this admiration felt almost oppressive. It followed her into rooms, settled into chairs beside her, lingered in pauses. It shaped how people looked at her, how they listened, how they interpreted even neutral actions. Charlotte learned to account for it, constantly adjusting her behavior to avoid unsettling the narrative. She wondered, not for the first time, what it would feel like to be known rather than admired, to be understood imperfectly, to be allowed contradiction. These thoughts remained unspoken, stored carefully away, because they carried implications she was not yet prepared to face. Admiration had granted Charlotte security and standing. It had smoothed her path and shielded her from scrutiny, but it had also rendered her distant, inaccessible, fixed. She existed as an ideal rather than a person, admired before she was known. And the longer this admiration endured, the more she sensed that understanding, when it finally arrived, would not be gentle. By the time Charlotte Astor reached the age at which others began to imagine themselves, her life had already been imagined for her, thoroughly, confidently, and without her consultation. The future arrived not as possibility, but as assumption, spoken of in calm, declarative tones that left no room for revision. It was not asked what she might wish. It was observed what she would do. The certainty surrounding her prospects was almost soothing in its consistency. Marriage would come at the appropriate moment to a man whose name aligned neatly with her own. Her household would be established with taste and discretion. Her public appearances would continue, refined but unchanged. Children would follow. Charity would occupy her energies. Her life would proceed along a path so well-worn that deviation seemed unnecessary, even unthinkable. Charlotte listened to these projections with polite attention, absorbing them as one absorbs weather forecasts, useful, impersonal, inevitable. They were delivered without urgency because urgency was unnecessary. Everyone involved assumed the outcome would unfold naturally, as long as nothing was disturbed. The machinery of expectation required only maintenance, not intervention. She noticed how often her future was discussed in her presence as though she were absent. Plans were outlined in conditional language that did not truly function as condition. When she marries, when she settles, when she takes her place, each phrase carried a quiet finality, suggesting not aspiration, but sequence. Charlotte was not choosing a life, she was moving through a predetermined order. This presumption extended into the smallest details. Preferences were anticipated before she expressed them. Objections were dismissed before they formed. Even uncertainty was managed preemptively, framed as youthful hesitation that would resolve itself with time. Charlotte learned that questioning her future was interpreted not as reflection, but as immaturity. The calm with which her life was forecast disturbed her more than overt pressure ever could have. No one argued with her because no one believed argument was necessary. She was not being coerced, she was being carried. The current was strong, smooth, and efficient, guiding her forward without turbulence. There were moments when she attempted cautiously to introduce ambiguity, a mild expression of disinterest, a pause where enthusiasm was expected. These moments were absorbed without friction, reinterpreted generously. She'll come around. She's simply thoughtful. She understands what's required. Charlotte realized that resistance, when subtle, was easily overwritten. She began to feel as though her life were a document already signed, awaiting only execution. The signature was assumed, the ink invisible. All that remained was compliance with timing. This realization did not provoke immediate rebellion. It produced something quieter and more unsettling: detachment. Charlotte moved through her days with increasing precision, fulfilling expectations effortlessly. The ease with which she performed only reinforced society's confidence in its assumptions. The better she adapted, the less anyone questioned whether adaptation was voluntary. Her competence became evidence of consent. Yet beneath this surface compliance, Charlotte sensed a narrowing. Options she had never consciously considered began to feel distant, implausible. The range of acceptable futures contracted until it resembled a single corridor, well lit and carefully monitored. The absence of alternatives was presented as security. Charlotte recognized it as something else. She wondered what would happen if she stepped outside this presumed completeness, if she disrupted the sequence, if she delayed or refused or redefined what had been arranged. These thoughts were not yet plans. They were pressures, building slowly beneath the polished surface of certainty. For now, the world around her remained satisfied. Charlotte Astor's life appeared complete in outline, awaiting only its proper unfolding. Society rested comfortably in this belief, reassured by the stability it promised. Charlotte, however, began to understand the danger of a life presumed finished before it had truly begun. Elegance, once mastered, did not simplify Charlotte Astor's life. It multiplied it. What had begun as a series of instructions, how to dress, how to speak, how to move, had hardened into an expectation of perpetual readiness. There was no off hour for refinement, no sanctioned moment when grace could be set aside like a pair of gloves at the door. The effort was invisible, which made it all the more demanding. Charlotte discovered that elegance was not sustained by occasional attention, but by constant correction. Each day required a quiet audit, appearance adjusted, tone moderated, pace controlled. Even fatigue itself had to be refined, disguised as composure rather than admitted as need. Tiredness was acceptable only if it remained undetectable. She felt this exhaustion most acutely in repetition. The same gatherings, the same conversations, the same rituals repeated with minute variation. Compliments recycled, expectations reaffirmed. Each event demanded the same level of attentiveness as the last, because any lapse, however small, would be noticed precisely because it was unexpected. Elegance allowed no margin for decline. Charlotte learned to measure her energy carefully, conserving it not for herself, but for presentation. She rationed enthusiasm, aware that excess invited suspicion. She rationed honesty, knowing it could complicate matters unnecessarily. Even joy was portioned, expressed just enough to satisfy observers without unsettling them. The physical toll manifested quietly. Muscles ached from controlled posture. Headaches arrived unannounced, dismissed quickly as inconveniences. Sleep offered little relief. The mind remained alert, rehearsing future obligations, revisiting past performances. Charlotte woke each morning already engaged in maintenance, correcting herself before anyone else had the chance. What made the exhaustion particularly isolating was its invisibility. Those around her assumed ease because they observed polish. They interpreted her steadiness as comfort. Offers of rest never arrived because no need was perceived. Charlotte had become so adept at elegance that it erased the evidence of effort entirely. She began to notice a subtle impatience within herself, not directed at others, but at the demands placed upon her attention. Small disruptions felt disproportionately draining. Unscheduled encounters unsettled her. The spontaneity of others, once charming, now felt invasive. Elegance required preparation, and preparation required predictability. In private moments, she questioned the purpose of this discipline. What exactly was being preserved? What catastrophe would follow if she allowed imperfection to surface? The answers remained vague, yet the fear persisted. Elegance, she realized, functioned less as adornment and more as defense. It protected her from scrutiny by preventing deviation. This realization did not bring relief. It deepened her fatigue. Charlotte understood now that elegance was not simply how she appeared, it was how she was expected to endure. It demanded endurance without acknowledgement, labor without recognition. The reward was continued approval, continued inclusion, continued safety. The cost was rest. She watched others succumb to this fatigue in different ways. Some grew brittle, their elegance sharpening into severity. Others retreated, their appearances becoming rarer, their influence fading quietly. Charlotte recognized these outcomes as warnings. To tire visibly was to risk relevance, and so she continued. Yet beneath the smooth exterior, something shifted. The exhaustion sharpened her awareness, making the artificiality of her world harder to ignore. Elegance began to feel less like achievement and more like obligation, fulfilled at great personal expense. Charlotte Astor remained admired, composed, impeccable, but the effort required to sustain. This image had begun to weigh on her in ways she could no longer fully conceal, even from herself. Elegance, she realized, was not effortless. It was exacting, and it was beginning to ask more than she could comfortably give. The whispers did not announce themselves. They never did. They arrived softly, carried on pauses, exchanged glances, and half-finished sentences that dissolved the moment Charlotte Astor turned her head. Society, she learned, preferred discretion in its cruelties. Gossip was not shouted, it was curated. Fans became instruments of this exchange, lifted delicately to conceal lips, angled just enough to suggest intimacy. They allowed words to travel without consequence. Charlotte noticed how conversations shifted when fans appeared, how voices lowered, how laughter softened, how attention fractured into smaller, more secretive units. The room remained outwardly composed, but beneath the surface, information moved efficiently. At first, Charlotte assumed these whispers did not concern her. She had done nothing to invite speculation. Her behavior remained flawless, her appearances consistent. Yet she soon discovered that perfection itself attracted commentary. The absence of scandal did not prevent discussion. It provoked it. People filled the void with conjecture, examining her composure for signs of hidden strain. She became aware of the rhythm of gossip, how it ebbed and flowed depending on proximity. Across the room, smiles remained warm. Nearby, voices softened. Charlotte learned to sense when she had become the subject, even if no one addressed her directly. A sudden quiet. A fan raised too quickly. A conversation interrupted mid-thought. What unsettled her most was not the content of these whispers, most of which she never fully heard, but their inevitability. Gossip did not require misbehavior, it required visibility. And Charlotte, by virtue of her name and her presence, provided ample opportunity. She noticed how gossip functioned as both entertainment and enforcement. It rewarded conformity by sparing those who complied, and it punished deviation by amplifying it. Women who strayed from expectation became cautionary tales, their reputations reduced to shorthand. Charlotte listened carefully to these stories, absorbing their moral without needing it stated. The whispers also revealed society's contradictions. Praise and suspicion coexisted comfortably. Charlotte could be admired openly and questioned privately in the same evening. Compliments delivered to her face were often followed by speculation once she moved on. Approval, she realized, was provisional, maintained only as long as behavior remained legible. She learned to manage her presence accordingly. Lingering too long invited scrutiny. Departing too early suggested avoidance. She calibrated her movements carefully, navigating rooms with an awareness sharpened by observation. Every choice carried implication. Every absence invited interpretation. The fans, those delicate symbols of refinement, fascinated her. They masked not only speech, but intention. Behind them, judgments were passed with efficiency and restraint. Charlotte recognized that gossip thrived precisely because it remained indirect. No one was responsible for it. No one could be confronted. This indirectness made it powerful. It shaped reputations quietly, altering invitations, alliances, and expectations without ever announcing its influence. Charlotte understood now why stillness and restraint were so prized. They limited material for speculation. Silence, when managed correctly, could starve gossip of substance. Yet silence was never absolute. Even the most careful lives produced whispers. Charlotte sensed that her control merely delayed the inevitable. Sooner or later something would be said, something always was. She began to consider what might happen if the whispers turned openly against her. If admiration gave way to curiosity, and curiosity to suspicion. The thought unsettled her, not because she feared exposure, but because she understood how little evidence gossip required. Perception alone was sufficient. As the evenings progressed, Charlotte learned to hear gossip without listening to it. She trained herself to recognize its presence without engaging. This detachment offered temporary relief, but it also deepened her isolation. The more she withdrew, the more she sensed herself becoming an object of observation rather than a participant. Whispers behind fans taught Charlotte an essential lesson, that society's greatest power lay not in what it said aloud, but in what it allowed to circulate unchecked. Reputation was not built solely through action, it was constructed through repetition, interpretation, and silence. And Charlotte Astor, admired and scrutinized in equal measure, began to understand that the quietest conversations often carried the most lasting consequences. Marriage, in Charlotte Astor's world, was never spoken of as intimacy. It was discussed instead as structure, sound, necessary, and designed to last. Like the great houses she inhabited, it was expected to bear weight without complaint, to distribute pressure evenly, and to conceal strain behind tasteful symmetry. Love, when mentioned at all, appeared as ornament rather than foundation. Charlotte learned this long before any proposal was imagined. She heard marriage described in terms of alignment and suitability, of names that complemented rather than clashed. Unions were praised for their balance, their discretion, their promise of continuity. A successful marriage, she understood, was one that altered nothing visible while securing everything essential. Conversations about her future followed this logic precisely. Potential matches were assessed as one might assess materials. Character was noted, but compatibility mattered more. Temperament was considered only insofar as it could be managed. Wealth was measured not for indulgence, but for stability. Each candidate was evaluated for how seamlessly he might integrate into the existing structure of her life. Charlotte listened to these discussions with practiced neutrality. Her presence did not alter their tone. She was expected to absorb the implications quietly, to recognize the care being taken on her behalf. Marriage, after all, was framed as protection, a reinforcement of her position, a guarantee against uncertainty. She began to notice how little space existed for personal inclination within this framework. Desire was regarded as unreliable. Affection was permitted only if it aligned with prudence. Passion, when acknowledged, was treated as something to be tempered over time. Marriage was not meant to inflame, it was meant to stabilize. This approach extended beyond her own prospects. Charlotte observed other unions closely, reading their outcomes like architectural case studies. Couples who performed harmony convincingly were praised regardless of private reality. Those whose differences surfaced publicly were regarded as cautionary examples. Discord, she learned, was not a personal failure, it was a design flaw. The language surrounding marriage reinforced this impression. People spoke of foundations, pillars, and support, of building something together, of securing a future. Rarely did anyone speak of vulnerability, of uncertainty, of change. Marriage was not imagined as a living thing, capable of growth or decay, but as a finished structure to be inhabited indefinitely. Charlotte found this both reassuring and unsettling. The promise of permanence offered safety, but it also suggested confinement. A structure, once built, resisted alteration. Rooms could be redecorated perhaps, but the walls remained. She wondered quietly what happened to those who discovered, too late, that the architecture did not suit them. Her questions remained internal. Outwardly, she conformed. She attended dinners where potential alliances were subtly displayed. She spoke politely, observed carefully, and offered nothing that could be interpreted as preference. This restraint was interpreted as good sense, as maturity. Society approved of her discretion, mistaking silence for agreement. Yet Charlotte sensed a narrowing ahead. Marriage loomed not as an event, but as a conclusion, a point at which her life would be considered settled, her purpose fulfilled. The structure would be complete, and any deviation thereafter would be treated as damage rather than choice. She recognized the irony. Marriage, intended to secure her position, threatened to finalize it, to fix her permanently within a design she had not drawn. This realization did not provoke immediate resistance, but it sharpened her awareness. She began to look at marriage not as destiny, but as construction imposed from outside. The comparison to architecture persisted. Just as rooms dictated movement, marriage dictated possibility. Just as walls provided shelter, they also defined limits. Charlotte understood now that marriage, in her world, was less about companionship than about containment. And as she contemplated the structure being prepared for her, she began, quietly, cautiously, to consider what it might cost to step outside its walls. The smile Charlotte Astor wore was not spontaneous. It was trained. It arrived early in her life, shaped gently through repetition, until it settled into muscle memory. At first, it was corrected, softened here, restrained there, until it achieved the precise balance society favored. Too much warmth suggested eagerness, too little invited speculation. The ideal expression conveyed openness without intimacy, pleasure without surrender, acknowledgement without promise. Charlotte learned this balance instinctively, though it had been taught relentlessly. She discovered quickly that the smile was not an ornament but a signal. It reassured others that she was at ease, that nothing disruptive lurked beneath her composure. It diffused tension before it could form. It answered questions no one dared to ask aloud. With a practiced curve of the mouth, Charlotte could confirm belonging, deflect scrutiny, and close conversations without appearing abrupt. Over time, the smile learned to hold. It held through fatigue, through boredom, through irritation, quietly swallowed. It remained in place during conversations that demanded attentiveness, but offered no engagement. It endured compliments repeated too often to feel sincere, inquiries that skimmed the surface without curiosity, judgments disguised as praise. The smile absorbed all of it, presenting steadiness where fluctuation might have unsettled the room. Charlotte noticed how others responded to this consistency. People relaxed in her presence. They assumed agreement. They mistook composure for contentment. The smile created an illusion of transparency, while revealing nothing essential. It became her most effective defense. Yet the discipline required was constant. The smile had to arrive on cue, linger appropriately, and retreat without awkwardness. It could not falter under pressure. Even moments of genuine amusement required calibration. Charlotte learned to moderate her reactions instinctively, shaping authenticity into something acceptable before allowing it to surface. There were occasions when the smile felt like armor. It shielded her from unwanted intimacy, from probing questions, from expectations she was not prepared to fulfill. But armor, once worn too long, becomes heavy. Charlotte began to feel the strain in quiet moments, when her face ached faintly from restraint, when relaxation felt unfamiliar, when her expression lingered even in solitude. She caught her reflection sometimes, surprised to find the smile still present when no one was watching. The realization unsettled her. What had once been deliberate had become reflexive. The boundary between performance and self blurred until she could no longer identify where one ended and the other began. Society rewarded this discipline generously. Charlotte was praised for her pleasantness, her grace, her approachability. People spoke of her kindness without knowing its cost. They admired her calm without recognizing the effort it required. The smile became evidence of her suitability for every role expected of her: wife, hostess, representative of a great name. Yet beneath this approval, a quiet dissonance grew. Charlotte sensed that the smile, perfected as it was, had begun to replace other expressions. It smoothed over not only discomfort, but desire. It moderated not only irritation, but curiosity. In holding so much back, it left little room for emergence. She wondered what would happen if she allowed it to fall, if she permitted her face to register uncertainty, dissatisfaction, or refusal. The thought felt dangerous, not because of any immediate consequence, but because it threatened to disrupt the illusion so carefully maintained. The smile was a promise society relied upon. To withdraw it would be to revoke reassurance. And yet, Charlotte felt increasingly aware of its weight. The longer she held it, the more she understood that it functioned as a boundary, keeping others comfortable, but keeping her distant. It preserved harmony at the expense of authenticity. The smile that learned to hold had served her well. It had secured approval, protected her from intrusion, and reinforced her place within high society. But as it settled permanently into place, Charlotte began to suspect that it was doing more than holding expression. It was holding her life in suspension. And one day, she knew, it would no longer be enough. Luxury surrounded Charlotte Astor so completely that it ceased to register as indulgence and began to function as boundary. It filled rooms, lined corridors, softened every surface, and yet, paradoxically, it narrowed her world. Comfort, when perfected, left no space for adjustment. Everything had already been decided. Her days unfolded amid abundance, calibrated to soothe. Chairs were upholstered to encourage proper posture. Curtains filtered light to a flattering consistency. Floors muffled sound, so footsteps never announced urgency. The environment anticipated her needs before she could articulate them, removing friction so efficiently that it also removed choice. Charlotte learned that when comfort is total, desire becomes unnecessary. Objects arrived without request. Dresses selected by others appeared in her wardrobe, perfectly suited to the season, the event, the expectation. Jewelry rested in velvet-lined cases, chosen for harmony rather than excitement. Even books were curated, appropriate titles, improving texts, volumes that reflected well on a household rather than challenged it. Luxury delivered not stimulation, but reassurance. She noticed how the abundance dictated behavior. In rooms designed to be admired, nothing could be misplaced. In houses built to display wealth, disorder carried moral implication. Charlotte moved carefully, aware that luxury did not tolerate disruption. One learned to treat it gently, respectfully, almost reverently. The environment demanded cooperation. There were moments when she longed for imperfection: an unbalanced chair, a window left open too wide, a space not immediately corrected. But luxury corrected itself relentlessly. Servants restored symmetry overnight. Small irregularities disappeared before they could be acknowledged. The world reasserted its calm, leaving Charlotte to wonder whether her discomfort had been imagined. Luxury also imposed pace, Nothing hurried. Meals unfolded in measured courses. Visits lingered precisely as long as required. Travel proceeded with buffers and contingencies that removed risk. Charlotte sensed that urgency was considered unbecoming, a sign of disarray. To rush was to suggest insufficiency. This slow, managed rhythm dulled impulse. Charlotte learned to postpone wants until they no longer felt urgent, then until they disappeared entirely. The environment rewarded patience and punished impatience subtly, making it easier to wait than to insist. Luxury taught her how to delay herself out of existence. She watched how others reacted to this abundance. Guests marveled, complimented, expressed gratitude. They treated luxury as privilege, not enclosure. Charlotte alone felt its pressure daily, its insistence that nothing be altered. The very completeness of her surroundings made dissatisfaction appear ungrateful, even irrational. The houses she inhabited were admired as achievements, monuments to success, order, and permanence. Yet, Charlotte began to experience them as fixed designs with no tolerance for revision. Walls did not move. Pathways were predetermined. Each room suggested how it should be used and by whom. Possibility narrowed with each refinement. Luxury, she realized, constrained not through denial but through fulfillment. When everything was provided, nothing could be pursued. When every comfort was assured, no discomfort could justify change. The environment argued against restlessness simply by existing so well. Charlotte felt this argument keenly. Any unease she experienced seemed to reflect poorly on her rather than on her circumstances. The fault, she was taught implicitly, must lie within. She adjusted accordingly, correcting herself rather than questioning the structure around her. Yet the constriction persisted. It pressed in quietly, shaping her movements, moderating her thoughts, narrowing her imagination. She began to sense that luxury was not neutral. It was directive. It guided behavior without issuing commands. It maintained order without confrontation. This realization unsettled her deeply. If luxury could shape a life so completely, what would it demand in exchange for its comfort? What freedoms had been traded silently, incrementally, without negotiation? Charlotte Astor moved through rooms of extraordinary beauty and felt for the first time a subtle longing for space, not more, but less. Less polish, less completion, less certainty. Luxury had given her everything she was meant to want, and in doing so, it had quietly taken something she could not yet name, but already missed. Impropriety, in Charlotte Astor's world, was not an act. It was a condition, one that could arise without intention, without announcement, and without clear cause. It lingered like a scent others claimed to detect before it was ever identified. One did not need to misbehave to invite it. One needed only to unsettle expectation. Charlotte learned this fear indirectly, through observation rather than warning. She watched how the word appeared in conversation, never spoken loudly, never fully explained. Improper was applied selectively, often after the fact, as though behavior only became objectionable once it disrupted comfort. The charge carried weight precisely because it was vague. No rule book existed. Judgment arrived retroactively. She noticed how quickly admiration could curdle into concern. A woman spoken of favorably one season might be regarded cautiously the next, her reputation altered by something no one could quite articulate. Impropriety did not require scandal. It required visibility paired with uncertainty. Charlotte absorbed this lesson deeply, sensing that the line she was expected never to cross was deliberately undefined. This ambiguity produced vigilance. Charlotte became acutely aware of context, how the same action could be harmless in one setting and questionable in another. Laughter shared too freely. A conversation prolonged beyond its usefulness, an opinion expressed with insufficient qualification. None of these were wrong in themselves, yet any could be interpreted unfavorably if they disrupted the expected rhythm. She learned to anticipate interpretation rather than intention. It was not enough to act correctly. One had to act recognizably. Originality risked misreading. Spontaneity invited speculation. The safest course was familiarity, behaving in ways that aligned so closely with expectation that no one felt compelled to examine them. The fear of impropriety did not arrive as panic. It arrived as habit. Charlotte felt it in the pause before speaking, the calculation before movement, the instinctive moderation of tone. She corrected herself continuously, often without knowing precisely why. The fear operated below conscious thought, shaping reflex and impulse until restraint felt natural. This fear extended beyond her own behavior. Charlotte found herself monitoring others, too, not out of judgment, but out of shared risk. Impropriety was contagious, she realized. To be associated with someone who invited speculation was to invite it oneself. Invitations became strategic, alliances, cautious, distance maintained politely. The irony was unmistakable. A society obsessed with propriety produced constant anxiety about its violation. Charlotte sensed that this anxiety sustained the system. Fear kept behavior predictable. Uncertainty kept people compliant. Impropriety functioned less as moral boundary and more as disciplinary threat. She began to wonder what, exactly, impropriety protected against. Disorder? Embarrassment? Change? The answers were never stated outright. They hovered, implied rather than defined. Charlotte understood only that impropriety threatened the illusion of control so carefully maintained. As she grew more aware of this mechanism, her compliance became deliberate rather than instinctive. She recognized moments when fear, rather than principle, guided her choices. This recognition unsettled her. It suggested that her restraint was not always virtuous, it was often defensive. There were nights when she lay awake considering the fragility of reputation, how easily it could be altered by rumor, by misinterpretation, by deviation too subtle to be anticipated. She realized that fear of impropriety functioned as a kind of invisible fence, enclosing behavior without ever being seen. Charlotte Astor remained well within its boundaries. She continued to move carefully, speak gently, and present herself impeccably. Society rewarded this consistency, mistaking fear for decorum. Yet the fear itself began to weigh on her. It narrowed her choices further, tightened the corridor through which her life moved. She sensed that if she continued to obey it unquestioningly, she would one day wake to find that fear, not conviction, had shaped every decision she made. And that realization, once formed, could not be entirely suppressed. Impropriety had not yet touched her, but the fear of it had already begun to do its work. Charlotte Astor learned early that doubt, when permitted to surface, must do so privately. It was public. Grace was expected to remain intact, uninterrupted by hesitation or inquiry. Society tolerated uncertainty only if it remained invisible. And so, Charlotte developed two lives that ran parallel without ever touching, one composed of polished appearances, the other inhabited quietly, behind closed doors and within her own thoughts. Outwardly, nothing shifted. She continued to move through rooms with the same measured ease, her demeanor unchanged, her responses predictable. Public grace had become second nature, a posture so deeply ingrained that it required little conscious effort. It was what others expected of her, and she delivered it reliably. Compliments continued. Approval remained steady. No one sensed disruption. Privately, however, something had begun to loosen. Doubt did not arrive as rebellion or defiance. It came as questioning without urgency, as thoughts that lingered longer than they once had. Charlotte found herself replaying conversations not to assess her performance, but to examine their assumptions. She revisited compliments, wondering what they truly affirmed. She examined the rituals of her life with growing attentiveness, noticing how often they functioned without purpose, beyond repetition. These doubts did not demand immediate answers. They accumulated quietly, forming a pressure rather than a plan. Charlotte recognized them as dangerous not because they threatened action, but because they resisted dismissal. Once considered, they could not be entirely undone. She guarded these thoughts carefully. Doubt, she understood, was a liability when exposed. It invited correction, concern, intervention. To express uncertainty was to signal instability, and instability unsettled others. Charlotte had been trained too well to invite such scrutiny, and so she contained her questions, allowing them space only in solitude. This separation required discipline. Public grace demanded consistency. Private doubt demanded honesty. Charlotte learned to shift between them seamlessly, presenting certainty outward while exploring ambiguity inward. The effort required was substantial, but she managed it with the same skill she applied to elegance and restraint. There were moments when the boundary threatened to blur, a question nearly voiced, a hesitation noticed too closely. In these moments, Charlotte corrected herself swiftly, smoothing over any sign of internal conflict. The smile returned, the tone steadied. Grace reasserted itself, yet the private life grew richer, more insistent. Charlotte began to notice the absence of language around her doubts. No one spoke openly of uncertainty. Lives unfolded as though guided by clarity rather than habit. This silence reinforced her sense of isolation. Doubt, she realized, was experienced individually, but managed collectively. Everyone had it, but no one acknowledged it. She wondered how others navigated this divide. Did they suppress their doubts entirely? Had they learned to ignore them? Or had they, like her, created private spaces where questioning could exist without consequence? The answers remained elusive, hidden behind the same public grace she herself maintained. The longer this duality persisted, the more Charlotte sensed its cost. Public grace required suppression. Private doubt required secrecy. Together, they demanded constant vigilance. There was no rest in this arrangement, no resolution. The two lives ran side by side, never intersecting, each incomplete without the other. Charlotte Astor remained admired, composed, untroubled in appearance. Society found no reason to intervene. Everything appeared as it should. But beneath the surface, doubt had taken root, not as rebellion, but as awareness. And awareness, once acquired, alters perception permanently. Charlotte began to see her world differently, recognizing patterns she had once accepted without thought. Public grace still served her well, but private doubt had begun to ask questions that grace alone could not answer. Charlotte Astor learned the boundaries of her world most clearly, not through instruction, but through observation. Society rarely explained its limits, it demonstrated them. The cautionary examples appeared quietly, one by one, each carrying a lesson no one formally articulated. There was always a woman whose name began to circulate differently, not with admiration, but with curiosity edged in concern. Her presence at gatherings diminished subtly. Invitations thinned. Conversations involving her shortened, grew guarded. Nothing explicit occurred. No announcement was made. Yet everyone understood that something had shifted. Charlotte watched these transitions carefully. The causes were often indistinct. A marriage that failed to produce harmony. A habit that became too visible. A remark repeated out of context until it hardened into character. Sometimes the offense was not behavior at all, but endurance, remaining unmarried too long, speaking too confidently, lingering without a defined role. Society interpreted stasis as deviation. What struck Charlotte most was how quickly certainty followed ambiguity. Once a woman's standing wavered, interpretation filled the void decisively. Grace once admired was reclassified as calculation, reserve reframed as coldness, independence reinterpreted as defiance. The narrative adjusted itself to accommodate exclusion. Charlotte noticed how compassion evaporated during these moments. Concern was expressed briefly, then replaced by distance. It was not cruelty so much as efficiency. High society protected itself by limiting exposure to uncertainty. Those who unsettled its equilibrium were not confronted. They were simply repositioned. The fallen women did not disappear entirely. They remained present, visible enough to serve as reminders. Their altered status became instructional. Charlotte watched how others interacted with them. Smiles carefully maintained, conversations kept shallow, associations managed strategically. The message was unmistakable. This is what happens when balance is lost. She studied the patterns closely. Women fell not for excess alone, but for inconsistency. A single misstep could be absorbed. Repeated deviation could not. What society demanded was reliability, predictability, the assurance that behavior tomorrow would resemble behavior today. Charlotte internalized these observations deeply. Each fall reinforced her caution, narrowing her sense of acceptable action. She learned not only what to avoid, but how easily avoidance could fail. Reputation was not a fortress, it was a performance that required constant renewal. She also noticed the silence surrounding these women's private realities. Their perspectives were never sought, their explanations irrelevant. Society did not inquire into intention, it responded only to effect. Once a woman was categorized as unstable or improper, nuance ceased to matter. Charlotte wondered what these women experienced privately, whether they felt shock, resentment, relief, or exhaustion, whether their fall was abrupt or gradual, whether they had sensed it coming and failed to prevent it, or whether prevention had never been possible. These questions remained unanswered, unasked aloud. To dwell on them risked identification. Charlotte understood instinctively that empathy, when too visible, could be mistaken for alignment. She observed, absorbed, and withdrew. Yet the lessons left their mark. Watching others fall produced a dual response within her, fear and clarity. Fear of becoming one of them, clarity about the system that enabled such swift reclassification. She saw now that society's order was maintained not through shared values, but through shared vigilance. This realization altered how she viewed her own security. Admiration, she understood, was provisional. Grace was tolerated only as long as it remained reassuring. The same mechanisms that protected her could, under different conditions, isolate her just as efficiently. Charlotte continued to perform flawlessly. She maintained her composure, her consistency, her restraint. But watching others fall introduced a new awareness, one that no amount of elegance could erase. It taught her that safety within her world was not guaranteed by virtue or intention. It was guaranteed only by continued alignment. And alignment, she was beginning to realize, came at a cost that grew heavier with every example she observed. The fallen women lingered in her mind long after their names ceased to circulate. They became markers along the narrow path she walked, warnings etched into the social landscape. Charlotte Astor did not yet know what she would do with this knowledge, but she understood now, with unsettling clarity, what happened to those who stepped beyond the lines drawn so carefully and so quietly around them. Silence had always served Charlotte Astor well. It preserved harmony, deflected scrutiny, and allowed others to project their comfort onto her composure. Yet as the years accumulated, she began to understand that silence was not neutral. It carried weight. It exacted payment. The cost revealed itself gradually, not as a single loss, but as a series of small erasures. Conversations passed where she might have spoken, and did not. Opinions formed and dissolved without articulation. Preferences softened into indifference. Each omission felt inconsequential in isolation. Together, they amounted to a pattern, a life shaped as much by what was withheld as by what was expressed. Charlotte became adept at the strategic pause. She learned when silence would be interpreted as agreement, when it would be mistaken for wisdom, when it would be praised as discretion. This skill protected her, but it also displaced her. Others filled the spaces she left open, speaking on her behalf, assuming her consent. Over time, these assumptions hardened into fact. She noticed how silence simplified interactions. It reduced the risk of conflict, eliminated the need for explanation, and preserved the smooth surface of social exchange. It was efficient. It was admired. It was also deeply isolating. To remain silent was to allow narratives to form without correction, to accept interpretations she might not share. The cost appeared most clearly in moments of quiet afterward, when Charlotte reflected on exchanges that had passed without her presence fully felt. She sensed a thinning, of voice, of agency, of self. Silence had begun to function as a substitute for choice. Not choosing had become a choice in itself, one that favored stability over truth. She observed this dynamic beyond herself. Others, too, relied on silence as protection. Entire rooms functioned on unspoken agreement, maintaining peace by avoiding articulation. Discomfort was absorbed rather than addressed. Discontent was managed privately. Society's calm depended upon collective restraint. Charlotte understood now that silence maintained order by preventing examination. To speak was to invite reassessment. To remain silent was to preserve the existing structure. This realization complicated her loyalty to the habit she had perfected. Silence had served her, yes, but it had also preserved conditions that increasingly felt restrictive. She began to sense that each unspoken thought carried residue. It accumulated, pressing inward. The effort required to maintain composure increased as the unexpressed gathered weight. Charlotte felt this pressure physically at times, a tightness in the chest, a restlessness that no amount of elegance could fully suppress. There were moments when words hovered at the edge of speech, urgent and unpolished. In these moments, Charlotte hesitated, calculating consequence. She measured the risk of disturbance against the relief of expression. Almost always, restraint prevailed. The words retreated, leaving behind a faint dissatisfaction that lingered longer than anticipated. She questioned whether silence truly protected her, or whether it merely delayed confrontation. The fallen women she had observed had not always spoken recklessly. Some had simply ceased to manage silence effectively. They had allowed uncertainty to surface, had permitted questions to be asked. The response had been swift. This knowledge reinforced her caution, and yet the cost continued to mount. Charlotte sensed that in maintaining silence, she was surrendering something incremental but essential, the ability to define herself beyond expectation. Silence allowed others to decide who she was, what she wanted, and where she would go next. She wondered what it would take to interrupt this pattern, to speak not dramatically but honestly, to claim space without spectacle. The thought remained tentative, fragile, but persistent. It suggested that silence, once so reliable, might no longer suffice. For now, Charlotte continued to say nothing. She smiled, nodded, listened. She preserved the peace that had been entrusted to her. Society rewarded her for it, as it always had. But in the quiet that followed each restrained moment, she felt the cost clearly. Silence was no longer merely a strategy. It had become a burden, one she carried with increasing awareness, and awareness, she knew, changed the meaning of every silence that followed. The question did not arrive dramatically. It did not interrupt Charlotte Astor's life with urgency or demand. It settled instead, quietly, into the spaces her silence had created. It appeared first as a passing thought, easily dismissed, then returned with increasing regularity until dismissal itself required effort. What was she permitted to want? The phrasing mattered. Charlotte did not ask what she wanted. That question felt too exposed, too indulgent. She asked instead what was allowed. The distinction revealed how thoroughly permission had shaped her imagination. Desire, she understood, was acceptable only when it aligned with expectation. Anything beyond that alignment risked impropriety, instability, consequence. She noticed how this question surfaced most often during moments of apparent calm, while seated in familiar rooms, while listening to conversations that repeated themselves with comforting predictability, while performing roles she could execute flawlessly without engagement. The question emerged not from dissatisfaction alone, but from a growing sense of redundancy. Charlotte had mastered her life as it existed. That mastery, once reassuring, now unsettled her. She examined her routines carefully, searching for traces of choice, invitations accepted automatically, appearances prepared without anticipation, conversations navigated without investment. Each action functioned efficiently, yet none seemed to originate from an internal impulse. The machinery of her life ran smoothly, but it did not feel directed. The question followed her into solitude. It lingered in the quiet after gatherings, in the moments before sleep, in the pauses between obligations. She found herself testing it cautiously, as though it might provoke response. What was she permitted to want, beyond what had already been arranged? The absence of clear answers disturbed her. She realized how little she had practiced wanting anything beyond approval. Desire had been trained out of her gradually, replaced by compliance in anticipation of others' needs. To want something independently felt almost transgressive, as though it required justification she did not possess. Charlotte attempted to explore the question abstractly, distancing it from herself. She considered other women, those who had stepped beyond expectation and paid the price. Were their desires truly excessive or merely unpermitted? Had they wanted too much or simply wanted allowed? The distinction seemed increasingly important. She noticed that society rarely condemned desire itself. It condemned its expression. Wanting was tolerated privately, even encouraged within safe boundaries, but wanting visibly, decisively, without apology, that unsettled people. It introduced unpredictability into a system designed to minimize it. This realization sharpened her awareness of her own restraint. Charlotte recognized how carefully she had managed her internal life, shaping even her thoughts to avoid discomfort. The question that now persisted represented a breach in that discipline. It resisted moderation. It demanded engagement. What troubled her most was not the content of the question, but its persistence. It did not fade with distraction. It did not resolve itself through logic. It lingered, adapting to context, reappearing in different forms. What would happen if she wanted something different? What would it cost? What would it require? She sensed that the question itself posed a risk. To entertain it too openly might alter her behavior, however subtly. Awareness could not be unlearned. Once she acknowledged the possibility of wanting beyond permission, the boundaries she had accepted so readily began to feel provisional. Charlotte did not yet imagine specific alternatives. The question existed without answer, an opening rather than a plan. But openings were dangerous. They invited movement, and movement invited scrutiny. She understood this instinctively, even as the question refused to retreat. For now, she contained it, as she had contained everything else. She did not speak of it. She did not act upon it. She allowed it to exist quietly, testing its weight, gauging its persistence. The discipline of her upbringing held for the moment. Yet the question remained, unchanged by restraint. What was she permitted to want? It followed her through rooms built for certainty, through conversations designed to conclude, through a life presumed complete. It pressed gently but insistently against the structure that had defined her so thoroughly. And Charlotte Astor began to understand that some questions, once formed, could not be answered by silence alone. The decision did not announce itself with clarity or resolve. It arrived without spectacle, without language, grand enough to be remembered later as a turning point. There was no moment of declaration, no dramatic rejection of what had been arranged. What occurred instead was quieter and far more dangerous. Charlotte Astor stopped correcting herself. At first, the change was so slight, it bordered on invisibility. A pause held a fraction longer than necessary, a response offered without its usual polish, a choice made without rehearsing how it might be received. These were not rebellions. They were omissions of discipline, failures, almost, to maintain the habits that had once defined her so completely. Charlotte did not mark these moments as decisions. She experienced them as relief, the effort she had expended for years, anticipating reaction, moderating tone, calibrating presence, eased almost imperceptibly. In its place emerged something less refined but more sustaining, attention to herself. She began to notice how she felt rather than how she appeared. Fatigue registered as fatigue rather than inconvenience. Disinterest was no longer disguised as politeness. The internal life she had long managed cautiously was permitted, at last, to occupy space. This shift did not alter her public image immediately. To those around her, Charlotte remained composed, admirable, reliable. The machinery of expectation continued to function because she had not dismantled it. She had merely stopped oiling it so diligently. The difference lay not in action, but in intention. For the first time, Charlotte allowed herself to act without ensuring the act would be reassuring. The realization unsettled her. She had expected guilt, fear, or exhilaration. Instead, she felt a quiet steadiness, a sense that something long deferred had finally begun. The decision, such as it was, had not been to defy society openly. It was simply to stop living entirely in anticipation of its response. This restraint had protected her for years. It had also exhausted her. Letting go of it felt less like rebellion and more like recovery. Charlotte noticed the world respond subtly. Conversations no longer flowed quite as predictably. Some people leaned in more closely, as though sensing a shift they could not articulate. Others grew faintly uneasy, mistaking her increased presence for unpredictability. Nothing was said aloud. Nothing needed to be. The decision's softness was its greatest strength. It offered no clear point of intervention. Society corrected visible deviation efficiently. But how does one correct a woman who simply stops managing herself so completely? Charlotte herself was unsure how far this change would extend. She did not imagine transformation. She did not fantasize about escape. She remained within the structures that had shaped her, moved through the same rooms, fulfilled the same obligations. The difference lay in how much of herself she withheld from the performance. She began to choose silence differently, no longer as default, but as option. She spoke when she felt compelled rather than when it was expected. She listened without immediately translating what she heard into strategy. These adjustments were small, but they altered the texture of her days. Most importantly, she stopped asking permission, quietly, internally, for her own responses. The decision remained unnamed. To name it would have required justification, and justification would have returned her to the logic she was attempting to loosen. She allowed it to exist instead as practice, renewed daily through attention rather than proclamation. Charlotte Astor had not yet shocked high society. Nothing dramatic had occurred. No scandal had formed. No rupture had been acknowledged. But the foundation had shifted. A decision made softly is the hardest to reverse because it does not rely on momentum or bravado. It relies on recognition. Charlotte had recognized something essential, that obedience, once conscious, becomes optional. And from that moment forward, even her stillness carried a different weight. At first, no one could say precisely what had changed. Charlotte Astor continued to arrive when expected, dressed impeccably, composed as ever. She spoke with the same careful clarity, moved through rooms with the same practiced ease. And yet, something in her presence no longer resolved cleanly into reassurance. It was not impropriety. It was misalignment. Society is exquisitely sensitive to deviation, even when it cannot yet name it. Charlotte felt this sensitivity almost immediately, registering it in the subtle recalibrations around her. A glance held too long, a pause that lingered, a conversational rhythm that failed to settle as predictably as before. Nothing overt occurred, but the atmosphere shifted in ways that could not be ignored. Her behavior, while outwardly correct, no longer aligned perfectly with expectation. Charlotte noticed it first in herself. She answered questions honestly rather than advantageously. She declined engagements without over-explaining. She allowed moments of quiet to remain quiet, resisting the urge to smooth them over. These choices were modest, unremarkable in isolation. Together, they altered the narrative others had relied upon. People began to hesitate around her, not in disapproval, but in uncertainty. They were accustomed to knowing what Charlotte would do, how she would respond, where she would position herself. That predictability had offered comfort. Its absence, however slight, introduced unease. Conversations became more careful, compliments more deliberate, questions subtly adjusted as though probing for clarity. Charlotte sensed the recalculation occurring in real time. Society was testing its assumptions, checking for error, searching for a frame that still fit. This was not yet scandal. Scandal requires spectacle. What Charlotte introduced instead was ambiguity, and ambiguity was far more destabilizing. She felt the pressure to correct herself, to return to alignment, to restore the ease she had once provided so effortlessly. The impulse rose reflexively, the old discipline asserting itself. But Charlotte resisted, not forcefully, but consistently. She did not overcompensate. She did not reassure. She allowed the misalignment to persist. The effect was immediate, though understated. Invitations arrived with less certainty. Conversations circled rather than advanced. People spoke of her with a new carefulness, as though acknowledging the possibility that their understanding of her might require revision. Charlotte understood the danger of this moment. Misalignment, if unresolved, invited interpretation. Interpretation invited gossip, and gossip, once mobilized, rarely paused for clarification. She knew this pattern well. She had observed it in others, and yet she did not retreat. What surprised her most was the calm that accompanied this choice. She had expected anxiety, perhaps even fear. Instead, she felt steadier than she had in years. The energy once devoted to constant adjustment was now available for attention, to her own thoughts, her own responses, her own pace. The world around her adjusted accordingly, though not comfortably. Some responded by intensifying their scrutiny, seeking reassurance through increased attention. Others withdrew slightly, unsettled by the uncertainty she now introduced. Charlotte noted these reactions without judgment. They confirmed what she had begun to suspect, that her role had never been merely personal. She had been functioning as a stabilizing element within a system that required constant affirmation. Her alignment had reassured others that the world remained intact. Her misalignment, however modest, signaled the possibility of change. This possibility frightened people, not because it threatened collapse, but because it threatened habit. Charlotte Astor had not violated any rule. She had not behaved improperly. She had simply stopped behaving predictably. And in a world built on repetition and assumption, unpredictability carried its own charge. The misalignment remained subtle, but it did not correct itself. Charlotte continued to move through society with quiet intention, allowing her behavior to reflect her interior rather than the expectations placed upon her. Each day reinforced the shift, making reversal less likely. She sensed now that the decision made softly had entered a new phase. It was no longer contained entirely within her. It had begun to register externally, altering how others perceived and positioned her. Behavior that did not align was not yet condemned, but it had been noticed, and once noticed, it could not be unseen. The shock, when it arrived, did not come with raised voices or hurried exits. It entered the room quietly, carried on Charlotte Astor's continued refusal to correct herself. Society had expected a recalibration, a return to the familiar rhythm, a smoothing over of the misalignment. When none came, uncertainty hardened into recognition. What unsettled people was not what Charlotte did. It was how calmly she did it. She continued to appear as she always had, elegant, composed, unmistakably Astor. Her voice did not sharpen, her manner did not harden. She did not announce her independence or frame it as defiance. The grace remained intact, and that was precisely the problem. Grace had always functioned as reassurance. Now it accompanied behavior that no longer served that purpose. Charlotte declined expectations without dramatizing refusal. She chose her time without apology. She allowed conversations to end unfinished. Each action was delivered with such courtesy that it defied confrontation. There was no obvious impropriety to correct, no emotional excess to contain. The system, accustomed to addressing disruption through discipline, found nothing to discipline. The shock emerged slowly, as realization rather than reaction. People began to understand that Charlotte's composure was no longer a promise of compliance. It was simply composure. Detached from obedience, it became unsettling. Society relied on visible cues to interpret behavior: hesitation, defensiveness, urgency. Charlotte offered none. Her calm denied others the emotional leverage they required to restore alignment. This denial produced discomfort. Conversations faltered not because of what she said, but because of what she no longer signaled. The familiar feedback loop, expectation, response, reassurance, had broken. Charlotte's grace now functioned as insulation rather than invitation. The shock deepened as people recognized its permanence. This was not a passing mood or a temporary deviation. Charlotte's behavior did not fluctuate. It did not escalate or retreat. It settled into consistency. Consistency, once admired, now provoked unease. Society attempted its usual remedies. Gentle reminders surfaced in conversation. Nostalgia for earlier versions of Charlotte appeared, framed as affection. "You've changed," delivered with a smile that suggested hope for reversal. Charlotte received these remarks politely and offered no explanation. Explanation would have implied negotiation. She offered none. The absence of explanation unsettled people further. Without narrative, they could not categorize her. Without category, they could not manage her. The shock lay in this loss of control, made more acute by the absence of conflict. Charlotte herself experienced the shift with measured awareness. She sensed the tightening around her, the subtle reorganization of social space. She was no longer relied upon as a stabilizing presence. She had become an anomaly, still, admired, still included, but now regarded with caution. What made this transition remarkable was its restraint. Charlotte did not raise alarms. She did not invite spectacle. She allowed the consequences to unfold quietly, trusting that her consistency would speak for itself. In doing so, she denied society its preferred tools of correction. Grace, once a signal of submission, had become a shield. This inversion confused observers deeply. Grace was supposed to indicate readiness to conform, not resolve to diverge. Charlotte's continued elegance rendered criticism awkward. To accuse her would require acknowledging that the issue lay not in her behavior, but in expectation itself. And expectation, once exposed, is difficult to defend openly. The shock delivered with grace proved more destabilizing than any overt rebellion could have been. It offered no clear point of resistance. It demanded interpretation rather than response. It lingered, unresolved, altering the social atmosphere with each repetition. Charlotte Astor had not yet been condemned. She had not yet been excluded. But she had achieved something far rarer and more dangerous. She had demonstrated that one could withdraw compliance without withdrawing dignity. And in a world that relied on the two being inseparable, that realization landed like a quiet, irreversible blow. Admiration does not vanish all at once. It wavers first, losing its certainty, its ease. What had once arrived freely now required deliberation. Charlotte Astor felt this shift not in words but in tone, in the way compliments were delivered more carefully, as though testing their footing before landing. People continued to admire her. They simply no longer trusted that admiration to behave as expected. Where praise had once flowed with confidence, it now arrived framed with qualification. She remained so composed, someone would say, the emphasis on remains carrying unspoken inquiry. Still elegant, another offered, the word still performing a subtle audit. Admiration had not withdrawn, it had begun to hedge. Charlotte noticed the difference immediately. Admiration, once expansive, had grown precise. It no longer affirmed the whole of her presence. It isolated features, her poise, her dress, her manners, treating them as separate from intention. The implication was clear. What she did well could still be praised, but what she represented was no longer assumed. This recalibration unsettled those who had relied upon her consistency. Admiration, in high society, functioned as a social lubricant. It smoothed exchanges, confirmed hierarchies, reduced uncertainty. When admiration grew unsteady, conversation grew cautious. Praise required context. Silence lengthened. Charlotte sensed herself becoming a subject of review rather than celebration. The change was most evident in how others positioned themselves around her. People no longer assumed alignment. They waited for cues that did not arrive. They mirrored her restraint without understanding its source. Admiration, deprived of certainty, began to behave like surveillance, attentive, measured, conditional. She recognized the pattern from watching others fall. This was the stage before reclassification, when society assessed whether deviation was temporary or structural. Admiration lingered because exclusion had not yet been justified. But its warmth had cooled, replaced by curiosity edged with concern. Charlotte did not attempt to stabilize it. She resisted the impulse to reassure, to return admiration to its former comfort. That comfort, she understood now, depended upon her submission. To restore it would require surrendering the quiet autonomy she had claimed. Instead, she allowed admiration to remain unsteady. This choice intensified the scrutiny. People examined her behavior more closely, searching for motive. Was she dissatisfied, defiant, influenced? The absence of explanation invited speculation. Charlotte remained silent, not as strategy, but as consistency. She refused to narrate herself for others' comfort. The result was a subtle distancing. Invitations still arrived, but with less insistence. Conversations still included her, but with greater care. Admiration persisted, but it no longer granted authority. Charlotte felt the shift as a loosening of influence, an easing of expectations paired with a tightening of judgment. She recognized the irony. Admiration had once confined her. Its instability now created space, but at a cost. The safety admiration provided had eroded. In its place stood uncertainty, less predictable and far less forgiving. Charlotte observed her own response with interest. She felt no regret. The steadiness she had gained internally outweighed the external unease. For the first time, Admiration felt optional rather than essential. This realization marked a profound change. Society, however, did not share her calm, admiration turning unsteady, threatened more than her reputation. It threatened the system that relied on clear signals. If someone as composed, as proper, as Charlotte Astor could step outside expectation without obvious consequence, what did that imply for everyone else? This question lingered beneath the surface of every interaction. Admiration, once a stabilizing force, now carried a hint of apprehension. It could no longer be offered freely without acknowledging risk. Charlotte Astor moved through this altered landscape with deliberate ease. She accepted praise without clinging to it. She tolerated distance without resenting it. The unsteadiness did not prompt retreat. It confirmed what she had already sensed, that admiration was not truth, but agreement. And agreement, once withdrawn, revealed how contingent approval had always been. Admiration had not abandoned her, but it had begun to reconsider. And in that reconsideration, Charlotte sensed the approach of something sharper, something less patient, and far less subtle. Panic in high society never announced itself as fear. It arrived disguised as activity. Charlotte Astor felt it first as acceleration, more conversations, more observations, more subtle interventions layered carefully atop one another. Where admiration had once steadied the room, its unsteadiness now produced motion. Society began to adjust itself around her, not outwardly, but internally, like a structure reinforcing unseen stress points. The concern was not that Charlotte had misbehaved. It was that she had behaved without instruction. High society depended upon predictability, not obedience alone. Predictability allowed anticipation. Anticipation allowed control. Charlotte's quiet independence disrupted this sequence. She had demonstrated that one could remain elegant, visible, and included without signaling alignment. This realization unsettled people far more than open rebellion ever could have. Panic emerged as correction. Friends reached out with renewed attentiveness, offering invitations framed as concern rather than obligation. Conversations returned to familiar ground, nostalgia employed as reassurance. People spoke fondly of tradition, of continuity, of how things had always worked, language designed to anchor Charlotte back into a shared understanding without directly challenging her. Others adopted a different tactic. They watched more closely. Her tone was assessed, her associations noted, her absences recorded. Panic sharpened observation, turning curiosity into vigilance. What might have been overlooked months earlier was now cataloged meticulously. Charlotte recognized this shift immediately. The air around her grew denser, more expectant. She was no longer merely observed. She was being monitored. Society was determining whether her behavior represented an anomaly or a precedent. The distinction mattered enormously. If Charlotte's misalignment proved temporary, it could be absorbed. If it proved durable, it would require containment. Panic arose from uncertainty about which response would be necessary. High society preferred problems it could categorize. Charlotte resisted categorization by refusing explanation. This refusal intensified the reaction. Without narrative, society could not rationalize her behavior. Without motive, it could not excuse or condemn it cleanly. Panic filled the interpretive void, producing speculation that moved faster than evidence. Charlotte sensed conversations happening just beyond her reach, decisions forming without her participation. She was not being consulted. She was being assessed. The system she had once stabilized was now recalibrating around her presence. What struck her most was the impersonal nature of this response. Panic was not directed at her as an individual. It was directed at what she represented, proof that the rules functioned by consent rather than inevitability. That realization frightened people more than any scandal could have. She observed the mechanisms of panic with clarity. It sought to restore order not through confrontation, but through pressure, through isolation disguised as concern, through repetition of norms framed as care. The goal was not to punish Charlotte, but to guide her back into alignment quietly. Charlotte did not resist overtly. Resistance would have provided clarity, something society could respond to decisively. Instead, she maintained her calm, her consistency, her refusal to narrate herself. Panic found no purchase in her demeanor, only in its own projections. This composure frustrated attempts at correction. Without visible distress, Charlotte offered no justification for intervention. Without anger, she denied society the opportunity to label her unreasonable. Panic required reaction. Charlotte provided none. The result was escalation. The conversations grew more frequent, the attention more focused. The atmosphere around her thickened with expectation. Panic, having failed to resolve itself quietly, began to prepare for firmer measures. Charlotte understood now that she had crossed an invisible threshold. The moment for subtle correction was passing. Society would soon decide whether to reassert control or withdraw approval entirely. Panic, once activated, did not linger indefinitely. It demanded outcome. She felt no urge to retreat. The calm she had cultivated held steady, even as the pressure mounted. She recognized that the panic surrounding her was not her responsibility. It belonged to a system encountering resistance it had not anticipated. High society had relied upon her alignment for years. Her withdrawal of it, gentle, consistent, unannounced, had exposed a vulnerability it could not ignore. And so, the panic continued, methodical and restrained, gathering itself for whatever conclusion it deemed necessary. Charlotte Astor remained exactly as she had been, elegant, composed, unmistakably present. It was everything else that had begun to unravel. Scandal, when it finally settled around Charlotte Astor, arrived without noise. There were no raised voices, no hurried departures, no public ruptures to mark its presence. It emerged instead as a shift in temperature, a subtle cooling that moved through rooms once warmed by familiarity. High society did not announce its disapproval. It simply adjusted. Charlotte felt the change in what was no longer said. Conversations that once flowed easily now paused at her approach, then resumed with altered emphasis. Invitations arrived later than before, framed more carefully, their phrasing softened by contingency. Compliments persisted, but they no longer gathered momentum. They hovered briefly, then dissipated as though reluctant to commit. The spectacle society preferred had failed to materialize. Charlotte had provided no dramatic act to condemn, and so scandal learned to function quietly. This absence of spectacle unsettled observers more than any overt transgression could have. Scandal traditionally required display, a breach of decorum that could be pointed to, narrated, resolved through censure. Charlotte offered none of this. Her behavior remained impeccable, her demeanor unchanged. There was no moment to seize upon, no line to quote, no scene to replay. And yet, the discomfort persisted. Scandal without spectacle operates through inference. It relies on implication rather than evidence, on accumulation rather than event. Charlotte sensed herself being repositioned through subtle means. Seating arrangements shifted. Introductions grew more formal. Familiarity thinned. The world did not expel her. It recalibrated her proximity. She recognized the pattern instantly. This was not punishment. It was containment. High society excelled at isolating deviations without acknowledging them. By withdrawing warmth rather than access, it preserved the appearance of civility while enforcing consequence. Charlotte remained present, visible, and included, just no longer central. The shift was elegant, restrained, and unmistakable. What troubled others most was the impossibility of explaining the scandal. People spoke around it, never through it. It's not that she's done anything, one might say, the sentence ending deliberately unfinished. One simply senses, another would add, trailing off as though language itself resisted completion. Charlotte became an object of atmosphere rather than accusation. Something about her no longer aligned, and that misalignment generated unease. Without spectacle, scandal relied on repetition, of distance, of caution, of reassessment. Each small adjustment reinforced the next. She experienced this transformation with clarity. The absence of confrontation made it easier to endure. There was no humiliation to resist, no defense to mount. The consequences unfolded gently, almost politely. This gentleness, however, carried its own weight. It denied her the opportunity to respond, to clarify, to resolve. Charlotte understood now that spectacle would have been simpler. It would have ended something decisively, Scandal without spectacle lingered, indefinite and adaptable. It followed her quietly, altering interactions without announcing itself. She noticed how others behaved in its presence. Some attempted neutrality, maintaining courtesy while withdrawing intimacy. Others leaned into caution, aligning themselves carefully away from her. A few, braver or more curious, continued to engage, though with visible awareness of risk. Charlotte noted these distinctions without judgment. They revealed more about the system than about her. What surprised her most was her own response. She felt no urge to reclaim her former position. The relief she experienced in no longer serving as reassurance outweighed the discomfort of marginalization. The quiet autonomy she had claimed remained intact, even as the world around her adjusted. Scandal without spectacle exposed something essential, that acceptance had always been conditional, contingent upon her utility. Once she ceased to perform reassurance, acceptance recalibrated itself efficiently. Charlotte saw this clearly and found to her surprise that the clarity steadied her. High society had begun to withdraw its confidence in her, not because she had erred, but because she had changed without permission. The scandal lay not in her actions, but in her refusal to narrate them for others' comfort. And so the quiet scandal continued, moving through rooms with restrained persistence. It reshaped relationships, altered expectations, and prepared the ground for whatever conclusion society deemed necessary. Charlotte Astor remained composed, present, and unmistakably herself. The spectacle others awaited never arrived, and in its absence, the scandal grew, patient, controlled, and impossible to confront directly. Control does not rush to reclaim itself. It waits, assesses, and then moves with precision. High society, unsettled by Charlotte Astor's quiet deviation, began its reassertion not through confrontation, but through structure, through the careful tightening of pathways that had once been assumed open. Charlotte sensed the shift immediately. It appeared first as guidance framed as concern, invitations accompanied by suggestions rather than expectations, conversations that redirected gently but firmly toward familiar conclusions, offers of assistance that assumed need without asking. Control, she realized, rarely announces itself as authority. It presents as care. People began to remind her, subtly, of what had always worked. They spoke of stability with renewed reverence, of tradition as protection, of how easily one could be misunderstood without the proper context. The implication was clear. Alignment was available, should she wish to return to it. All that was required was a visible correction. Charlotte listened politely and declined nothing. Outright. She accepted the concern without absorbing its premise. This refusal to engage on the terms offered frustrated the process. Control depends upon participation. Without it, even the most refined mechanisms struggle to function. The system adjusted. Where suggestion failed, structure intervened, access narrowed, opportunities appeared selectively, contingent upon compliance rather than merit. Introductions were curated, information arrived later, filtered more carefully. None of this was punitive. It was administrative, a reordering designed to restore predictability. Charlotte understood the intention immediately. By constraining her movement subtly, society hoped to guide her back into alignment. Limited choice often produces gratitude for what remains. Control relies on scarcity as much as authority. She observed this process with increasing detachment. The clarity it provided was bracing. For years, she had believed her ease of movement resulted from approval alone. Now, she saw how carefully that ease had been managed, extended, and withdrawn as necessary. Control had always been present. It had simply been invisible while unchallenged. The pressure to conform intensified in small, cumulative ways. Decisions that had once been hers now arrived prearranged. Preferences were anticipated and corrected in advance. The system attempted to reduce her autonomy not through force, but through convenience. Charlotte resisted this convenience quietly. She declined prearranged solutions. She asked questions rather than accepting assumptions. She moved deliberately, refusing to be hurried into agreement. Each small act of independence introduced friction, slowing the system's attempt to absorb her. This resistance was not dramatic. It did not invite confrontation. It simply denied control the efficiency it required. The result was a stalemate. Control reasserted but incomplete, met with composure rather than compliance. Those enforcing this reassertion grew, increasingly careful. Direct pressure risked exposure. To acknowledge control openly would have required admitting its existence. Instead, they relied on implication, hoping Charlotte would correct herself voluntarily to restore ease. She did not. Charlotte began to sense the limits of society's tolerance. Control could be reasserted only so far without spectacle, and spectacle remained undesirable. To move beyond these measures would require acknowledging that Charlotte's behavior represented not a misunderstanding, but a challenge. This acknowledgement did not arrive easily. It threatened the illusion that order persisted naturally, without intervention. High society preferred to believe its authority self-sustaining. Charlotte's resistance forced a reconsideration of that belief. As the weeks passed, the mechanisms of control grew more apparent. Charlotte recognized patterns where she had once seen only courtesy. She saw how inclusion functioned as incentive, how withdrawal operated as correction. The system revealed itself precisely because it was being used against her. This revelation did not produce fear. It produced clarity. Charlotte Astor understood now that control, once visible, loses much of its power. It relies on subtlety, on consent, on the belief that outcomes are natural rather than engineered. By refusing to internalize its directives, she weakened its hold over her. Control had been reasserted around her, yes, but it had not been reabsorbed. The space between structure and self remained, narrow but intact. And in that space, Charlotte stood, calm, observant, and no longer willing to mistake guidance for destiny. Isolation did not arrive as absence. It arrived as abundance carefully withheld. Charlotte Astor remained surrounded by rooms filled with people, by conversations unfolding within reach, by invitations that continued to arrive with polite regularity. To any casual observer, her life appeared unchanged. She moved through society as she always had, visible, acknowledged, addressed with courtesy. And yet, something essential had withdrawn. She felt the isolation most keenly in proximity. People stood near her without engaging. They spoke to her without speaking with her. Conversations unfolded around her presence rather than through it, as though she had become a fixed element of the room rather than a participant within it. Inclusion persisted, but intimacy had been quietly revoked. This form of isolation was deliberate. High society rarely expelled its own outright. Exile was too conspicuous, too final. Instead, it practiced dilution, reducing influence, thinning connection, allowing presence to remain while significance diminished. Charlotte recognized the method immediately, having watched it applied to others. She had simply never expected to experience it herself. The distance was never acknowledged. No one spoke of exclusion. Smiles remained warm, manners impeccable. Concern was expressed occasionally, framed carefully as affection. "You seem quieter these days. You must be tired." These remarks carried no invitation to respond. They served instead as markers, identifying her difference without addressing it. Charlotte found herself occupying a peculiar position, close enough to observe everything, distant enough to affect nothing. Decisions were made nearby, but not with her input. Opinions formed without her contribution. She remained present, yet functionally peripheral. What unsettled her most was how quickly this isolation normalized. People adapted with remarkable ease. The system recalibrated smoothly, assigning her a new role without announcement. She was no longer a stabilizing presence. She had become a tolerated anomaly. She observed the effect on her own habits. Conversations required more effort to sustain. Engagement felt tentative, provisional. She found herself hesitating before speaking, not from fear, but from the awareness that her words no longer carried weight. Silence, once strategic, now felt imposed. And yet beneath this marginalization, Charlotte experienced an unexpected clarity. The isolation stripped away illusion. It revealed relationships for what they had been, conditional, contextual, sustained by alignment rather than affection. The loss, though real, was precise. She mourned not companionship, but expectation. There were moments of sharp loneliness, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but persistent. She felt it in the pauses after gatherings, in the absence of unsolicited confidences, in the way conversations concluded more quickly than before. Isolation, when subtle, does not announce itself. It accumulates. Charlotte did not attempt to correct it. She understood instinctively that isolation was not a misunderstanding. It was an outcome. To reverse it would require resuming her former role, offering reassurance she no longer wished to provide. The cost of reintegration had become clear. She also noticed how isolation altered perception. Freed from constant engagement, she observed more keenly. She saw how others navigated the same structures she had stepped away from, how they performed alignment, absorbed correction, avoided attention. Isolation sharpened her understanding of the system's mechanics. In this distance, Charlotte discovered something unexpected: steadiness. The pressure to manage others' comfort had eased. The need to anticipate reaction diminished. While isolation removed influence, it also removed obligation. She no longer functioned as reassurance, and in relinquishing that role, she reclaimed attention for herself. This trade was not without pain. Isolation in plain sight carries its own cruelty. It denies recognition while preserving exposure. Charlotte felt seen without being acknowledged, present without being included. Yet even this discomfort felt preferable to the exhaustion of constant alignment. High society had succeeded in isolating her without spectacle. The process was elegant, restrained, effective. Charlotte remained visible, polite, and peripheral. But isolation had not produced compliance. It had produced perspective. And from that perspective, Charlotte Astor began to understand that the greatest cost of belonging had never been restriction alone, but the quiet erasure of self that belonging required. Independence in Charlotte Astor's world was rarely acknowledged as virtue. It was treated as anomaly, subtle but unmistakable, a disturbance that demanded containment rather than celebration. Charlotte had long cultivated restraint, composure, and grace, yet the quiet autonomy she had claimed now began to exact its consequences. The punishment was neither loud nor immediate. It arrived as recalibration, invisible to anyone outside the carefully observed inner circle of society. Invitations continued, but they arrived strategically, late, qualified, selective. Conversations persisted, yet those nearest her subtly shifted focus. Her opinions, once received with unquestioned acceptance, were now met with caution, as though she had spoken beyond her proper remit. The punishment was not correction, it was adjustment, applied gently but persistently until independence could be neutralized without spectacle. Charlotte felt the effect keenly. Where alignment had once guaranteed inclusion, deviation now produced calculation. Every movement she made, every choice of gesture or word, was interpreted through the lens of her independence. Society no longer assumed compliance. Its attention, formerly reassuring, now pressed upon her, examining for error, for motive, for signs that she might overreach. The eyes she had long counted on to admire now flickered with expectation, subtle unease or assessment. The strangest part of this punishment was its invisibility. There were no overt accusations, no raised voices, no gestures of exclusion. Society does not punish independence with spectacle when restraint can achieve the same effect. Instead, it withdraws certainty. Approval becomes conditional. Familiarity becomes selective. Presence alone, once sufficient, is no longer guarantee of inclusion. Charlotte learned that being noticed and being controlled were not mutually exclusive. They were often inseparable. She observed the methods with clarity. Senior figures would invite her into conversation only to frame it narrowly, testing her response. Alliances she had counted on were re-examined, subtly shifted toward compliance. Observers who had once deferred now lingered with heightened attentiveness, ensuring that her autonomy did not disrupt the expected order. Charlotte saw these measures as elegant but restrictive mechanisms designed to contain influence without inviting rebellion. The punishment worked not by inflicting discomfort directly, but by recalibrating her environment. Freedom, once assumed in subtle ways, became provisional. She was permitted to Exercise agency only, insofar as it did not alarm, confuse, or inconvenience those invested in maintaining the status quo. Even minor acts of decision-making carried weight because they reminded others that predictability was no longer guaranteed. Independence, the very quality she prized, had transformed into a responsibility of risk. Charlotte recognized the irony. The qualities that had sustained her, grace, composure, tact, were now being used as instruments to measure and limit her independence. Her capacity to navigate society with poise had preserved her in appearance, but it had also rendered her behavior legible, and legibility invited regulation. Independence, in other words, was tolerated only until it became evident. She felt the isolation that accompanied this quiet punishment, a subtle distancing that reinforced control without confrontation. Those nearest to her remained courteous, attentive even, but their engagement was cautious, their assumptions recalibrated. Autonomy, she learned, carries its own consequences. Admiration persists, but authority wanes. Participation is permitted, but only on terms dictated externally. Yet, Charlotte did not recoil. She understood the mechanisms at work and observed them without panic or resistance. The punishment was clear, but it was not absolute. She could continue to exercise autonomy quietly, strategically, and without spectacle. It required patience, awareness, and endurance, qualities she had long practiced. In the stillness of her rooms, Charlotte reflected on the cost of independence. It was neither freedom nor rebellion that was punished, but the perception of self-direction. Society sought to reassert order through subtle recalibration, using admiration and inclusion as instruments rather than rewards. Independence demanded vigilance, restraint, and courage, for it was punished not with noise, but with adjustment. Charlotte Astor remained composed, visible, and elegant, yet the price of autonomy had become unmistakable. Every measured step, every calm expression carried with it the weight of subtle correction. The punishment of independence was not immediate, but it was persistent, and Charlotte understood that to navigate it required mastery of the very skills she had long cultivated. Reputation, in Charlotte Astor's world, was neither static nor personal. It existed as a network of perceptions, sustained by observation, whispered judgments, and the repetition of expectation. What one did mattered only insofar as it could be interpreted and catalogued. Charlotte learned this truth early, but she had not anticipated the speed and subtlety with which a life so carefully curated could be rewritten without spectacle or announcement. The process began quietly, almost imperceptibly. Conversations that once flowed easily around her now paused briefly, then continued with deliberate modification. Praise, once unqualified, now arrived shaded with reservation. Attentive smiles, casual nods, and polite inclinations carried meaning far beyond courtesy. They were markers, indicators that something within the familiar pattern had shifted. Charlotte could sense the recalibration in real time, though no word was spoken to confirm it. Her reputation, once assumed immutable, began to bend under the weight of observation. Actions that had previously confirmed her place in society were now reframed. Composure became calculation, independence became defiance. Silence, once discretion, now suggested secrecy. The qualities that had secured her admiration became, in the eyes of others, evidence of divergence. Charlotte observed this transformation with careful attention. She noticed the shifts in seating arrangements, the subtle redirection of conversation, the change in proximity when she entered rooms. These were not errors or accidents. They were deliberate recalibrations designed to test her alignment, to measure the persistence of her behavior, and to define her anew. What unsettled people most was the absence of drama. There was no scandal to exploit, no breach to punish openly. Charlotte's demeanor remained impeccable. Her grace was intact. She had transgressed not by act, but by refusal to conform invisibly. The very normalcy of her presence now carried a quiet challenge, a proof that admiration, once granted, need not dictate action. Observers filled the interpretive vacuum with narrative. They speculated on her motives, her intentions, her loyalties. Conversations about her shifted from certainty to conjecture. Praise became careful acknowledgement, recognition tempered with assessment. People noted minor choices, behaviors previously overlooked, and assigned meaning with a precision that exceeded her own awareness. A smile held too long, a gesture too faintly directed, a word left unsaid. All were indexed, interpreted, catalogued. Her reputation was in motion. Charlotte understood the paradox. To maintain composure under scrutiny was both protective and revealing. She had learned to navigate society with skill, yet her mastery had made her legible. Legibility was a tool of order. It allowed society to predict, to assign value, to intervene when deviation threatened the system. By continuing to act with grace and control, she had given observers the exact material they required to rewrite her story. In solitude, she reflected on the implications. The reputation that had once protected her had become a framework for adjustment. What was once a shield had been transformed into a lens through which every decision, every inclination, every quiet assertion of self was magnified, interpreted, and repurposed. She realized that she had not been punished overtly. She had been catalogued, understood, and redefined. And yet, Charlotte remained undisturbed. She had long understood that perception is malleable, shaped by expectation and assumption. While others revised their view of her, she preserved her own understanding of self. The discrepancy between perception and reality was not a failing. It was a space in which she could maneuver, subtle, deliberate, and measured. By the end of this subtle redefinition, Charlotte's presence carried new weight. She was admired still, but that admiration was no longer unconditional. It was infused with observation, tempered with caution, and reliant on continued engagement. Society had rewritten her reputation quietly, efficiently, and irrevocably, but she had also rewritten quietly her relationship to it. Charlotte Astor had not lost her standing. She had only realized with startling clarity that the standing itself was never hers to control. And in that realization lay both constraint and freedom. Doors had always opened for Charlotte Astor as if by instinct, as though the world anticipated her presence and prepared itself accordingly. Invitations arrived before she requested them, greetings anticipated her approach, and opportunities were extended in careful, measured sequence. Yet, as she matured, Charlotte began to notice a subtle alteration in the way those doors opened, less eager, more calculated, and tinged with expectation rather than ease. The change was imperceptible to anyone unobservant. A hostess might appear welcoming, but her smile carried a slight reservation. A servant might linger a moment longer before acknowledging her presence. Invitations remained frequent, but each came accompanied by a suggestion or a reminder, subtle signals that she was being monitored, assessed, managed. The world had not closed its doors entirely, but it no longer assumed they would swing freely at her discretion. Charlotte perceived this immediately, noting the shift without surprise. Society, she realized, was not punitive in the blunt sense. It corrected subtly, through space, through timing, through the careful distribution of attention. Doors could close without locks and open without warmth. Inclusion was now conditional, granted only as long as she moved in ways that maintained reassurance. She observed the mechanisms at work around her. Hosts subtly rearranged seating, positioning companions to frame her in a particular light. Conversations subtly redirected, curving toward safe subjects that confirmed her conformity rather than challenging it. Opportunities arrived timed precisely to assess her reaction, her willingness to engage on terms already dictated. Charlotte understood the pattern at once. The world had reasserted its influence not through denial, but through expectation. The effect was disorienting. For years, she had relied upon predictability to navigate rooms, gatherings, and households. The doors had opened without question, and she had walked through them smoothly, confident that her presence alone commanded access. Now, she had to consider timing, reception, and the subtle signals embedded in behavior before she could step forward. Each entry became a negotiation, unspoken yet pervasive, between expectation and autonomy. Yet this recalibration revealed something Charlotte had not anticipated: the world's dependency upon her. Though the doors had shifted, they still responded to her presence. Her calm, composed demeanor, once assumed, continued to affect others. She could slow the flow of conversation, draw attention without demanding it, and alter social rhythm with a gesture so slight it might go unnoticed. The doors opened differently, yes, but they remained connected to her influence. Charlotte reflected on the paradox. Control was being asserted around her, yet it required her cooperation, even passively. The doors were not locked. They merely tested her response. How she moved, what she chose to reveal, and when she chose to act, all informed the pace, tone, and shape of engagement. Independence, she realized, could coexist with these constraints if wielded carefully, quietly. The awareness sharpened her perception of the social landscape. She recognized which thresholds were truly optional and which were imposed. She measured steps, words, and glances against invisible standards, noting where compliance was expected and where subtle deviation could be accommodated. Every room, every corridor, every threshold became a stage in a delicate choreography that had always been present, but now revealed in its full intricacy. Charlotte Astor moved forward with deliberate care, neither retreating nor acquiescing. The doors opened differently, but she retained the power to choose whether to enter fully, step partially, or linger in the space just beyond threshold. With that awareness came a quiet sense of freedom. Autonomy, she understood, was never complete, but it could be preserved even when expectations shifted. The world had changed around her, yes, but Charlotte, poised and deliberate, moved through it without faltering, learning not only how to navigate doors that opened differently, but how to define which thresholds truly belonged to her. Freedom, Charlotte Astor soon realized, was a paradox in her world. It existed, undeniably, but never without boundaries. The Gilded Age promised liberty through wealth, influence, and refinement, yet every liberty carried with it invisible strings, fine as silk, taut enough to constrain without being felt directly. Charlotte learned early that autonomy was conditional, granted selectively and revoked without declaration. Her movements, while outwardly unrestricted, were framed by expectation. She could walk through drawing rooms, enter conversations, accept invitations, but always in ways that satisfied unseen observers. Timing, tone, and gesture were not her own to dictate entirely. Each choice could be interpreted, recalibrated, or responded to silently by those who watched. Freedom, she discovered, was permitted so long as it did not disrupt the equilibrium others relied upon. The lesson arrived gradually, in subtle interactions. A hostess might smile warmly, then hesitate before offering a seat, watching Charlotte for response. An invitation would arrive promptly, yet phrased carefully, as though testing comprehension of protocol. Approval was conditional, accessible only if she presented herself in alignment with established expectations. One could be seen, acknowledged, even admired, but never entirely at liberty. Charlotte began to map these invisible conditions. She noticed which rooms allowed greater latitude and which demanded the strictest adherence. She understood how conversations were structured to permit expression while discouraging divergence. She discerned patterns in social timing, the ebb and flow of attention, and the ways that silence itself was regulated. Each detail conveyed a rule, unwritten but rigorously enforced. This awareness shaped her behavior. She learned to exercise autonomy carefully, choosing moments when discretion could mask intent. She spoke with precision, acted deliberately, and navigated expectations without violating them overtly. Even small deviations carried weight. A glance held too long, a word spoken too plainly, a hesitation that lingered. All were recorded in subtle perception. Freedom required not only skill, but constant vigilance. Yet the very constraints that limited her also clarified the power she possessed. Autonomy, even conditional, allowed her to shape interactions from within the system. The allowance of choice, small, strategic, carefully observed, became a tool. By understanding the boundaries, Charlotte could navigate them to her advantage, subtly altering expectations, testing reactions, and exercising influence without provocation. Conditional freedom was not the absence of liberty. It was a framework for its deliberate use. She also saw how others responded to her restrained exercise of choice. Courtiers, peers, and confidants adjusted their behavior in anticipation, often unaware that they had been guided. By her quiet autonomy, admiration persisted, Respect remained intact, and the machinery of society continued to function. Yet she, for the first time, recognized the leverage embedded in her comportment. Freedom, it seemed, need not be total to be potent. The paradox persisted. The same conditions that enabled her agency also imposed surveillance. Every step required assessment, every word was measured, every appearance carried the potential for judgment. She could act, but only in ways that would not provoke correction. Conditional freedom was a delicate dance, balancing assertion with subtlety, desire with discretion. Charlotte reflected on the implications. She realized that autonomy had always existed, even when she had believed herself constrained. What changed was recognition, the understanding that choice could be exercised quietly, deliberately, and without spectacle. The constraints were real, but they did not negate the power of intention. By mastering these subtleties, Charlotte Astor moved through her world with increasing confidence. Freedom with conditions was no longer a limitation, it was a skill. And in that skill, she discovered the quiet, controlled authority that would allow her to navigate society on her own terms, even as the boundaries remained visible, delicate, and absolute. High society remembers. It does not forgive so much as it archives, cataloging every action, gesture, and word in meticulous sequence. Charlotte Astor understood this instinctively, long before she fully grasped its consequences. The corridors she traversed, the drawing rooms she entered, the conversations she attended, they were not fleeting experiences. They were entries in a ledger, preserved quietly, recalled subtly, and applied to her reputation with unerring precision. The memory of society is cumulative. One small misstep, observed but unremarked, might linger in silence for years, resurfacing at the precise moment when it could exert maximum influence. Charlotte had watched other women fall victim to this principle. A glance interpreted wrongly, a laugh remembered too vividly, an opinion offered in error. Each transgression, no matter how minor, became part of a narrative that would be referenced silently, shaping invitations, alliances, and access long after the event had passed. Charlotte's own behavior was scrutinized with extraordinary care. Every movement she made, every gesture she allowed, every hesitation she permitted was recorded in the collective consciousness of her peers. The elegance she displayed, the stillness she cultivated, the grace with which she navigated social expectations, all of these were preserved alongside observations of her misalignments and the quiet autonomy she had begun to assert. Each aspect of her comportment existed simultaneously as admiration and as data. She began to perceive the weight of this long memory in the smallest interactions. Hosts would invite her to gatherings with an unspoken proviso, observing her responses carefully, gauging whether she conformed to the expected rhythm. Conversations, while polite, were framed to test boundaries subtly. Compliments carried subtle qualifiers, reassurance measured against deviation, admiration given with one eye always on precedent. The past was present in every gesture, a persistent ledger that influenced her reception before she had entered the room. This archive was unforgiving. Memory does not temper, it does not contextualize, it recalls. It interprets absence as significance, hesitation as intent, silence as choice. Charlotte found that even actions perfectly aligned with expectation could be read differently if preceding behaviors had deviated. The cumulative weight of observation allowed society to enforce norms without overt instruction. She began to understand that consistency was not merely preferred, it was essential to remain legible within the system. Yet the long memory of high society was not absolute. It preserved patterns, not certainties. Moments of clarity, brilliance, or composure could be recalled as evidence of excellence. Flaws, conversely, became lessons for others, reminders of the costs of deviation. Charlotte realized that the ledger worked in both directions, documenting not just limits, but possibilities. One's legacy was constructed from both compliance and resistance, each weighted by perception. Charlotte also noted the moral economy of this memory. It punished without ceremony, enforced without declaration, and guided without negotiation. Those who failed to maintain alignment were quietly marginalized, their influence diminished incrementally. Those who maintained grace and discretion were rewarded with inclusion, authority, and admiration, but always provisional, always observed. The ledger never forgot, and the memory of society never allowed forgiveness to be total. As she reflected, Charlotte felt the pressure of the ledger pressing inward. To navigate effectively, she had to remain conscious not only of the present, but of accumulated perception. Every interaction required forethought, every gesture demanded awareness. Her autonomy, though preserved, existed within the constraints imposed by a collective memory more exacting than any individual authority. And yet, in recognizing this, she discovered a measure of power. Understanding the ledger allowed her to move deliberately, to shape perception, to exercise quiet influence without appearing to act at all. High society's memory was long, but Charlotte Astor's attention, cultivated through years of observation, was longer. In a world where the past never fades, she began to see that mastery lay not in defiance or concealment, but in knowing precisely how to inhabit each moment while remaining legible and unforgettable. Charlotte Astor realized with quiet clarity that glamour had always been both a gift and a constraint. It protected her, elevated her, drew admiration and opportunity. Yet it also shaped her movements, her thoughts, her very presence, dictating subtly what was permissible and what was not. For years she had allowed it to function as armor, a polished surface reflecting expectation rather than desire. Now, she began to reclaim it, not by rebellion, but by conscious intention. The reclamation was subtle. She did not abandon elegance or refinement, for both remained essential in her world. Silk continued to shimmer at the slightest movement. Lace framed her face and hands with meticulous precision. Jewelry glimmered in carefully measured accents, never overwhelming, always deliberate. Yet beneath this surface, something had shifted. She began to inhabit her appearance as choice rather than obligation. Each gesture, each step, each tilt of the head carried her authority, not merely her compliance. Charlotte understood that glamour had power beyond admiration. It shaped perception, directed attention, and orchestrated interactions. By reclaiming it, she reclaimed agency. She could present herself intentionally, allowing her presence to command respect without surrendering autonomy. Where previously the polish had been applied to soothe others, now it was harnessed to assert herself. Elegance became an instrument of influence rather than a mirror of expectation. The effect was immediate, though unspoken. Peers noticed the difference in ways they could not articulate. Their glances lingered longer, assessments slowed, and assumptions faltered. Charlotte's composure remained impeccable, yet it no longer served merely as reassurance. It conveyed deliberation, choice, awareness. The space she occupied now felt less defined by precedent and more by her presence within it. Glamour reclaimed was also a shield. It allowed her to navigate scrutiny without concession. Observers could interpret her movements, but their interpretations could no longer dictate her intentions. She smiled, spoke, and gestured as she pleased, maintaining social grace while subtly undermining assumptions. Where silence or stillness had once masked autonomy, deliberate elegance now amplified it. Charlotte exercised this reclaimed glamour with precision. Her entrances became statements of measured authority. Conversations were guided subtly, without disruption or confrontation. Her attire reflected preference rather than prescription. Her expressions conveyed intelligence and discretion rather than mere decorum. Each element reinforced her presence, not submission. Yet this reclamation was not without cost. It required heightened attention, constant awareness, and vigilance against misreading by others. High society monitored closely. Every choice, dress, tone, posture, was observed and interpreted. To wield glamour intentionally meant to anticipate these readings and shape them proactively. It was performance, yes, but performance chosen rather than imposed. Charlotte also recognized the psychological liberation it offered. The exercise of agency within visible structure restored a measure of self-possession that had long been deferred. The rooms that once constrained her movements now became arenas in which her autonomy could operate quietly, gracefully, unassailable because it appeared natural. In reclaiming glamour, Charlotte Astor had not rejected society. She had mastered it. She had learned to inhabit expectation while simultaneously redefining it. The elegance that once demanded obedience now conveyed power. Her presence, polished and deliberate, became an instrument of choice, subtle yet unmistakable. Charlotte understood, finally, that true influence resides not in rebellion or spectacle, but in the quiet reclamation of what one has always been given. Glamour, once a mirror of expectation, had become a declaration of self, and she carried it forward, radiant, composed, and entirely her own. Charlotte Astor began to observe the machinery of high society not as participant, but as historian. The patterns she had once absorbed unconsciously now revealed themselves with deliberate clarity, each interaction and expectation forming part of a living, evolving system. She understood that society was not static. It aged, adapted, and preserved itself, and she, by navigating it carefully, had become both witness and influence. The signs of aging were subtle. Rituals once taken for granted began to shift in rhythm. Greetings elongated or contracted, invitations arrived with altered emphasis, and attention once freely given became measured. Older peers assumed new authority, younger ones tested boundaries. Every adjustment reflected accumulated experience, a slow recalibration based on observation of outcomes over decades. Charlotte realized that her presence, once defined entirely by alignment, now interacted with this evolving network of expectation in ways she could predict and sometimes influence. She noticed that change was rarely abrupt. The system did not overhaul itself dramatically. It adapted gradually, using small variations to maintain continuity while accommodating new pressures. Practices that had once enforced conformity through subtle cues became more pronounced in response to independent actors like herself. Seating arrangements shifted, conversational paths redirected, and social emphasis subtly reassigned, all without confrontation. Society aged like a well-maintained clock, its gears turning invisibly, steadily, with precision born of repetition and observation. Charlotte reflected on her role within this aging structure. Her past compliance had helped stabilize it. Her misalignments now tested its flexibility. Every deviation, however measured, illuminated the elasticity of rules and the fragility of assumed authority. She understood that the system could absorb only so much unpredictability before it responded, either with adjustment or exclusion. Watching this unfold, Charlotte felt a rare sense of mastery. She had learned to move within it without being fully constrained, to engage without yielding entirely. She became acutely aware of generational shifts as part of this evolution. Older matrons carried influence differently than they once had, favoring observation and interpretation over direct intervention. Young women learned strategies from observing outcomes, mimicking grace while negotiating minor deviations. Charlotte saw herself situated between these forces, inheriting the lessons of past generations while observing the rise of new actors. Society, she realized, was both teacher and experiment, preserving legacy while testing adaptation. Even the rituals themselves revealed their age. Dinners unfolded in patterns inherited from decades past, yet subtle modifications had crept in, courses timed differently, introductions framed with slightly altered emphasis, movements around rooms adjusted to accommodate new standards of visibility. The outward continuity suggested permanence, but the adjustments indicated that nothing was immutable. Charlotte learned to read these signs carefully, recognizing where control remained absolute and where discretion allowed flexibility. This awareness transformed how she navigated her world. She no longer relied on the assumption that her reputation or alignment would grant her seamless inclusion. She anticipated the system's adaptations, understanding which behaviors would be scrutinized, which would be overlooked, and which might shift influence subtly in her favor. Every gesture, every expression became part of a dialogue with the evolving social order. Charlotte also recognized the moral dimension of this aging system. It preserved hierarchy through observation, reward, and restraint, yet it rewarded neither novelty nor challenge easily. Deviations, when tolerated, were temporary, tested for elasticity. She realized that her independence and subtle influence were exceptional precisely because they negotiated the system's inherent conservatism. In watching the system age, Charlotte Astor gained a quiet authority. She saw its limits and its persistence, its adaptability and its rigidity. She understood the delicate balance between conformity and autonomy, influence and discretion. And in that observation, she recognized her power to move through society with elegance and independence, shaping the world not by rebellion, but by knowing it intimately, anticipating its evolution, and placing herself deliberately within its gears. Charlotte Astor became aware, with a mixture of curiosity and quiet calculation, that she was no longer merely a participant in society. She had become a lesson, a model, a point of observation for younger women entering the same intricate world. They watched her with careful eyes, noting posture, speech, and gesture, cataloging each subtle indication of power, restraint, or deviation. In this way, she realized, her influence extended far beyond admiration or reputation. It shaped expectation itself. These young women approached with caution. They had been trained to read signals, to anticipate approval, to calibrate behavior before speaking or moving. Yet, Charlotte's presence disrupted simple calculation. She carried composure with autonomy, grace with discretion, independence without spectacle. To those observing, she was both aspirational and enigmatic, a standard they could follow, but one they could not replicate without understanding the unseen calculations that guided it. Charlotte began to note the patterns in their observation. Eyes lingered on the angle of her hand, the tilt of her chin, the modulation of her voice. Pauses in conversation were studied, not to challenge, but to learn. Questions were framed carefully, gauging her response without overt intrusion. She could feel the weight of this scrutiny, subtle yet persistent, and recognized that these younger women were attempting to map her mastery onto their own emerging conduct. Her influence was most apparent in the smallest details. When she smiled with measured warmth, they observed how to convey approachability without surrendering authority. When she declined an invitation with quiet poise, they learned how to assert choice without appearing discourteous. When she navigated an awkward conversation with unflappable calm, they recorded the technique, mentally cataloging how restraint could be used as power. Every gesture became a lesson, every choice a template. Charlotte understood the duality of this attention. On one hand, it flattered her. Recognition is powerful when extended to the impressionable, and she felt the satisfaction of witnessing her strategies internalized and rehearsed. On the other hand, it imposed subtle constraints. She could no longer act without consideration for the implications of demonstration. Every deviation, every misstep might be observed, internalized, and misapplied. Her autonomy had, in part, become public property, even as she continued to navigate society on her own terms. The dynamics of observation also revealed society's continuity. The younger women were carefully trained to read cues and reproduce decorum, ensuring that norms persisted even as generations shifted. Charlotte, through her quiet assertion of independence and mastery of elegance, introduced attention, a model of composure that included autonomy, suggesting that alignment need not equate to submission. They learned to admire while simultaneously noting the boundaries of power. Charlotte's awareness of her role as both subject and instructor altered her own behavior subtly. She moved with deliberate care, aware that demonstration carried influence. Her gestures were refined without rigidity, her expressions calibrated without constraint. She allowed small acts of independence to persist, understanding that they provided lessons in agency, subtle yet profound for those watching. Yet she remained vigilant. Influence is not instruction, and she could not dictate interpretation. Observers would absorb selectively, distorting what they did not understand. The risk was that imitation without comprehension might yield error or misunderstanding, threatening both her authority and the lessons embedded in her conduct. Charlotte Astor, conscious of this layered attention, maintained her equilibrium. She continued to navigate society with grace and deliberation, knowing that she was no longer simply performing for peers or elders, but serving as a measured standard for those who would follow. The younger women observed closely, and in doing so, Charlotte recognized the subtle, enduring power she wielded, the power not merely to exist within high society, but to shape it quietly, profoundly, and irreversibly. Charlotte Astor began to perceive, with a clarity that had taken years to cultivate, that her life was no longer strictly defined by the rhythms and dictates of high society. She had long navigated expectations with elegance and precision, ensuring that her presence reassured, her actions conformed, and her silence preserved harmony. Yet the quiet autonomy she had cultivated began to evolve into something more audacious, a life lived outside the strictures she had once observed without question. The transformation was imperceptible to most, measured in subtle deviations rather than dramatic acts. Charlotte chose conversations that did not advance reputations, but satisfied her own curiosity. She lingered in rooms for moments that served no purpose other than observation or reflection. She permitted small, unremarkable choices, seating herself where it felt natural rather than socially prescribed, allowing gestures to linger longer than strictly necessary, letting pauses remain unfilled. Each of these small liberties, innocuous in isolation, coalesced into a pattern, a life no longer entirely dictated by the expectations of others. The effect on her peers was immediate, though largely unspoken. Observers noticed the slight asymmetry in her comportment, the subtle delays in her responses, the calm patience with which she engaged when engagement had not been required. These minor divergences, so carefully measured, generated unease. Society relies upon predictability, and predictability is fragile. Charlotte's quiet independence introduced cracks, small at first, then widening with each repeated assertion of agency. Charlotte herself experienced a quiet exhilaration. Freed from the constant need to reassure, to anticipate, to align, she discovered a richness in her own observation and choice. Rooms she had once navigated as a student of decorum now revealed layers she had not perceived, the unspoken hierarchies, the subtle tensions, the gestures that conveyed intention rather than obligation. She saw the possibilities of social interaction not merely as patterns to be mastered, but as landscapes to explore with intentionality. Yet, living outside expectation carried its own weight. The freedom she embraced was conditional, delicate, and always observed. The admiration of peers persisted, but it no longer arrived with unquestioning warmth. Invitations were still extended, yet often framed with caution. Conversations, while polite, were now measured to gauge her reactions. Independence, she realized, was both her gift and her scrutiny. To step beyond alignment was to invite attention, to be observed not merely as exemplar, but as anomaly. Charlotte's strategy was careful and deliberate. She exercised autonomy without excess, asserting choice without provocation. She allowed deviation to accumulate quietly, signaling possibility rather than defiance. By managing perception without relinquishing self, she created a space in which her life could be lived on her own terms while still participating in the structures that shaped it. This life outside expectation revealed contradictions inherent in high society. Compliance had once been rewarded, deviation punished. Now, subtle independence generated both admiration and anxiety simultaneously. Charlotte recognized that her value had shifted. She was no longer merely a stabilizing presence, a measure of grace and conformity. She was a demonstration of possibility, proof that decorum could coexist with discretion, elegance with autonomy. In these quiet moments of assertion, Charlotte understood the profound stakes of her existence. To live outside expectation was to negotiate constantly, to maintain vigilance while embracing freedom, to balance influence with personal discretion. It was exhausting, yet exhilarating. She had not rebelled openly, nor had she sought to dismantle the system. She had simply begun to inhabit it differently, deliberately, intentionally, and entirely on her own terms. Charlotte Astor had stepped beyond the scripts written for her, and in doing so, she discovered a life defined, not by expectation, but by measured, graceful self-possession. Charlotte Astor understood, as few could, that a name carries weight far beyond the individual it identifies. The Astor name had sheltered her, elevated her, and provided access to a world measured by wealth, etiquette, and legacy. Yet she also knew that it imposed limitations, inscribed expectation, and demanded conformity. By the time she began to assert her quiet autonomy, she recognized that the name itself had begun to evolve in response to her choices. The Astor name, like society itself, would be different after her. She observed the effect of her actions with deliberate attention. Family members, peers, and observers adapted to her presence in ways subtle but unmistakable. Where once the name conjured only composure, refinement, and adherence, it now suggested independence, subtle authority, and measured defiance. Those who had relied on the presumption of predictable alignment found themselves recalibrating, invitations rephrased, introductions considered more carefully, attention distributed more cautiously. The Astor name had always demanded acknowledgement. Now it demanded awareness. Charlotte understood the paradox of inheritance. Names carry power, yes, but they are neither fixed nor self-sustaining. The actions of their bearers shape perception as surely as deeds or fortune. Every subtle decision she made, whether a deliberate pause in conversation, a gesture allowed to linger, a carefully withheld smile, altered the narrative attached to her family. The Astor name, she realized, had become a living symbol, its definition contingent not solely on history, but on her presence and behavior. Her influence extended further than she initially imagined, young women observing her, peers consulting her indirectly, even older relatives. Each interpreted the name through the lens of her autonomy. They saw that decorum could coexist with discretion, elegance with quiet power. They noticed that alignment was no longer absolute, and that agency could be exercised without spectacle or scandal. The Astor name, in their minds, expanded. It encompassed more than lineage, wealth, and tradition. It now carried proof that one could move with grace while asserting independence. This evolution did not come without tension. Some interpreted her autonomy as risk, others perceived it as subtle challenge. Invitations, once freely extended, were now mediated by discretion. Praise, once unconditional, became measured. Yet the name itself, its prestige, its history, its authority, remained intact, strengthened paradoxically by her exercise of choice. Charlotte's presence did not diminish it. It refined it, demonstrating that power need not be rigid to endure. Charlotte reflected privately on the responsibility this carried. The Astor name was both inheritance and obligation. Every misstep, or even perceived deviation, might be magnified, interpreted, remembered. Yet, with awareness came opportunity. She could shape expectation, influence perception, and extend the meaning of the name beyond what had been predetermined. It was no longer simply a symbol of protection. It had become a vessel for subtle transformation. The subtlety of her influence was deliberate. She did not seek notoriety, nor did she invite scandal. Her changes were quiet, almost imperceptible, woven into the very fabric of her social presence. The legacy she forged did not disrupt, but redirected, allowing the name to carry authority that was both admired and quietly interrogated. By the end of this realization, Charlotte understood something profound. The Astor name afterward would not merely reflect history, it would reflect possibility. It would carry the lessons embedded in her composure, her grace, her autonomy. It would signify not just who her ancestors were, but who she had become. Charlotte Astor moved through society with measured certainty, aware that the name she bore was no longer simply inherited. It was rewritten subtly and irreversibly by her presence, her choices, and her quiet insistence on inhabiting the world on her own terms. Charlotte Astor began to understand the peculiar way history observes those who inhabit high society. It does not record every detail. It preserves only what fits a narrative, what reinforces expectation, what confirms lesson. In her world, as in the larger world beyond, memory is selective, curation invisible, and meaning often imposed after the fact. Charlotte had long sensed this principle, but it became unmistakable as her quiet autonomy took shape. Her actions, her comportment, and even her presence would be remembered or forgotten according to what society deemed instructive. She noticed this first in the whispers of her contemporaries. Stories of her composure, her elegance, her meticulous care were recounted repeatedly, repeated as example, internalized by young, women and peers alike. The anecdotes, however, were partial. They emphasized grace and discretion, restraint and refinement. They rarely acknowledged hesitation, introspection, or private doubt. They told of the external, not the internal. Charlotte recognized that history, even contemporary history, was curated. The memory of her would be shaped less by her lived experience than by the impressions she left, the expectations she subverted, and the lessons others drew from her conduct. The selectivity of memory became more apparent as she observed generational shifts. Younger women studied her carefully, absorbing behaviors that could be replicated safely, discarding those that seemed too audacious. Older peers adjusted their recollection, highlighting her consistency, her tact, her obedience to decorum, while downplaying moments when she diverged subtly from expectation. Even family remembered her in terms of narrative efficiency. The deviations that troubled them were minimized. The accomplishments that reassured them were preserved. Charlotte began to perceive that memory serves as a tool of social continuity, reinforcing norms while sanitizing anomaly. This selective memory carried both advantage and risk. It allowed Charlotte's reputation to endure, insulated from scrutiny that might exaggerate minor errors. Yet it also meant that her true intentions, her private struggles, and the quiet assertions of autonomy that she had cultivated might be forgotten entirely, or worse, misunderstood. Society preserved narrative, not nuance, lesson, not truth. In the ledger of memory, she was both immortalized and obscured, celebrated and anonymized simultaneously. Charlotte found the process unsettling, yet illuminating. It demonstrated that influence does not depend solely upon action, but upon perception, what others observe, remember, and repeat. Every gesture, every decision, every moment of measured independence contributed to the portrait that would endure. Entwined in this, she discovered a form of subtle power. While memory would never be complete or fully accurate, it could be guided through careful presentation, calibrated behavior, and deliberate consistency. She also understood the moral dimension embedded in memory's selectivity. By preserving examples and erasing anomalies, society maintained its hierarchy, communicated its lessons, and reinforced its values. One could be celebrated precisely because deviation was tolerated quietly but recorded selectively, a controlled risk that reinforced the narrative without inviting open challenge. Charlotte's quiet defiance, her composure paired with autonomy, became a lens through which others interpreted the rules, an exemplar, a caution, a subtle guide. Charlotte reflected upon the paradox of being remembered this way. The story that would endure about her might not capture her interior life, the struggles, the decisions, or the small victories of independence, yet it would capture influence, whether she desired it or not. Her life, lived with restraint and intention, would be filtered through society's selective memory, shaping perceptions long after she ceased to act within its rooms. She realized then that history's judgment, quiet, partial, and curated, was inseparable from the legacy she had already begun to forge. It was both protective and confining, affirming and incomplete, and Charlotte Astor, always deliberate, understood that she must continue to inhabit the world with grace, awareness, and subtle assertion, shaping what would be remembered even as the true fullness of her life remained unseen. In the hands of memory, she thought, even autonomy becomes part of the story society wishes to tell. Charlotte Astor had long understood that shock in society is rarely immediate, explosive, or conspicuous. It arrives as awareness, as recalibration, as a realization that expectations, so carefully constructed, so meticulously rehearsed, can be unsettled without drama. By the end of her gradual assertion of autonomy, Charlotte perceived that the shock she had provoked was not merely a moment of disapproval, nor a scandal whispered in corners. It was far more profound. It was the exposure of society itself, of its assumptions, its fragility, and its dependence upon conformity. The shock manifested in subtle behaviors, almost imperceptible to casual observation. Invitations were phrased with caution, compliments delivered with reservation, conversations redirected to test alignment. Even her admirers, previously unquestioning, began to measure their responses, hesitant to assume the safety of prior patterns. The elegance and composure she had always displayed now carried a dual function. They reinforced admiration while simultaneously revealing the limitations of expectation. Charlotte realized that shock need not be loud to be lasting. It need only illuminate the cracks in a system presumed unbreakable. Society, she observed, was startled not because she had rebelled openly, but because she had moved differently without asking permission. She had neither announced defiance nor demanded attention. She had simply existed on her own terms within a framework that had assumed alignment. The realization that a figure so central, so admired, could deviate without spectacle unsettled everyone around her. It prompted questions, small, cautious, unspoken questions about what authority, status, and respect truly depended upon. Charlotte noticed the subtle reverberations of this shock in the eyes of those who observed her most closely. Senior peers, accustomed to predictable behavior, tilted their assessments, scrutinizing not only her choices but the system that had sustained them. Younger women, the apprentices of social propriety, studied her with heightened attention, seeking to understand which aspects of conduct could be adapted without reprisal. The shock extended far beyond the individual. It had become an education, a demonstration of possibility, a revelation that even the most polished structures had limits. She reflected on the cost of this awakening for others. High society had long relied on predictable patterns to maintain order, to distribute influence, to reinforce hierarchy. Charlotte's calm independence, measured, deliberate, and graceful, exposed the fragility of that reliance. Observers were compelled to reconsider assumptions, question norms, and acknowledge that control, while formidable, was neither absolute nor permanent. Shock, in this context, functioned as both lesson and warning. It demonstrated that authority relies on consent, and that consent can be withheld without overt confrontation. Charlotte herself experienced the shock differently. She felt neither triumph nor malice. She felt recognition. The society that had so carefully monitored, guided, and restrained her was responding to her presence with unspoken evaluation. Its structure was revealed in the pauses, the calibrations, the moments of hesitation she observed. She understood that her influence was now systemic. She shaped not only perception of herself, but perception of the norms, expectations, and behaviors that govern the world around her. In the quiet culmination of this understanding, Charlotte realized that shock was less about disruption than illumination. It did not punish, it did not ostracize, it clarified, it revealed dependence, fragility, and potential. The shock she had produced was enduring because it had forced recognition of autonomy, agency, and the subtle power inherent in restraint exercised deliberately. Charlotte Astor remained composed, impeccably elegant, entirely herself, and yet the world around her had shifted imperceptibly but irreversibly. Shock, she now knew, was not spectacle. It was revelation. It was the quiet understanding that even the most ordered society cannot endure unchallenged observation without reevaluating its foundation. This, Charlotte recognized finally, was the deepest consequence of all. Shock had arrived, and it had left a permanent imprint not on her, but on history itself.